Hello and welcome to yet another video. This is the second episode of the story in which Naruto accomplished the impossible. You cannot stop the flow of time. Its will only rotates in one direction. A mere human cannot change that path. This story is from Dorsey. Please support him, her. She is also a digital artist, so please visit her profile. Please like and subscribe to show your support. Let's get the show started. Toraku was in ecstasy. He grinned like an idiot while sitting on the bed, not bothering to pay attention to the still-speaking Minato. He was getting out of here, and that was the only thing that mattered now. He hated this isolation. He wanted to go outside, he wanted to just roam the streets, and he wanted to start building his new life. Toraku, are you even listening to me? Yes, sure. Then what was the last thing I said? Something about extra conditions and supervision. Toraku had scratched the back of his head in embarrassment and Minato let out a sigh in his irritation. I can't believe he's doing this. I told you, that besides the approval, there are conditions, and they are important, so I would really appreciate your attention. Sorry. I'm listening now. Toraku gave him an apologetic look. To become a shinobi, we first have to survey your skills in order to seat you in one of our ranks. We already saw some of your skills, but those don't even scratch the surface, I think. You will participate in a sparring match tomorrow. Do that, and in time you will be assigned to one of the teams. Will I fight with you? Minato didn't answer, only smiled at him. You know, actually I don't think I really thought this through. I mean, the knowledge is inside me, I know, but I don't know how to push it to the surface. I'll be beaten into the ground. This is why you'll do it tomorrow. Why? What about today? We will be going to the training grounds, to test your basic knowledge a little and to gain some experience on how you can tap that knowledge during action. I want a proper assessment, and I'm afraid if you go there in this state tomorrow, you will be beaten into the ground for sure. Besides, Inoichi will also be making a checkup on the state of your memories today, and will be doing so every weekend until the Hokage deems necessary. Toraku's expression saddened and he looked down to start playing with a wrinkle in the sheet. He doesn't trust me, does he? I think this is understandable. You appeared from nowhere under more than suspicious circumstances. And you? Toraku looked up to face with the familiar blue eyes of Minato. Do you trust me? What I think isn't important. Minato looked back at the blonde without any expression on his face. However, Toraku was an awful actor. His face mirrored his emotions without hesitation. Disappointment and a small amount of betrayal flashed through his face, but in the background he also saw that he understood his own situation more than he let on. I see. Come on. Inoichi is waiting. 5 minutes later they entered the familiar interrogation room with the pale white walls and find Inoichi leaning against the wall playing with the ring on his finger. Sorry for the late arrival. It's okay, I also just arrived. Hello Inoichi Ajizan. Toraku waved a hand toward the man who just raised an eyebrow at the title. You seem more energetic than the last time. We met. The young boy answered only with a foxy wide grin. The Yamanaka waved his hand toward the chair in front of him and Toraku sat down without a word, closing his eyes. You can start any time. Inoichi nodded and placed his hand on the teenager's forehead who rolled his shoulders at the uneasy feeling as he entered into his mind. The seasoned shinobi had went through the familiar passage stuffed with books and scrolls to enter the symbolic door to his memories, now more prepared for the blinding white scene. He tilted his head to the side as he looked over the calming white desert again. As he looked over his own shoulder to get a full look around himself, he spotted a long table, filled with files, sorted by date with some small leaflets and markers for the most important ones. These are the memories of this past week. Not too much, for a week, but it is understandable. Toraku had spent that period almost entirely in his room, mostly in isolation without any companion or entertainment. As Inoichi stepped back to observe the files on the table, he noticed something from the corner of his eyes. Something seems different. He moved his head around once more on the pleasant landscape and he realized only minutes after his first step the obvious difference. The white sky became bluer, with thin clouds floating lazily within it, which made the boy's mindscape more peaceful and more natural, if that was possible. The tall blonde shinobi shook his head in irritation. How the hell could I have missed something like that? With slow steps in the fine sand he reached the table and the files, randomly choosing one and flipping through the pages for a quick check. I dreamed about the blonde girl again. I really wish I know her name, at least then I would be able to finally tell a proper prayer for her soul. Today I was allowed to visit the village for the first time. It was fantastic. The plethora and cavalcade of people, the crowd and the continuous bustle. I'm really missing it. But I was finally able to tell my decision to Minato. Inoichi had closed the file and placed it back to its origin, and let out a small sigh while he tried to luxuriate every moment in this place, before he had to leave. As he sniffed the air, he recognized again the familiar scent of lilies. He turned around slowly for one last time to memorize every little detail of this dreamland, and sniffed once more the calming scent in the hope that it would last until he headed home. The blonde let out a final sigh and left the boy's mind to return to his own consciousness. Toraku was sitting, breathing heavily, but it wasn't as bad as the first time. When he managed to catch his breath, he looked up to Inoichi with curious eyes, but only received a slow shake of his head. I found only the past week's memories. Nothing new appeared. Toraku just nodded, waiting patiently in front of the wondering eyes the shinobi until he finally spoke. You like lilies? Inoichi asked. Curiously. Huh? The young teenager answered back with the perfect mask of confusion when the odd and out-of-place question reached his ear. You mean the flower? He thought, tapping his cheek with a wondering face after the shock of the strange question wore off. I don't know. They have a nice smell, so I guess so. Inoichi just nodded and gave him a small smile before he left the room without any proper answer, waving a quick goodbye to Minato, who looked after him curiously. Toraku gave a confused look at the door where he last saw the swinging blonde locks, but he only shrugged and turned to his companion. Hey, Minato. Yes? Just wondering, if we're going to the training grounds, shouldn't you remove the remaining seals from me? The ones that hold back my chakra? Yeah. But first we have to reach the field. I don't want any accidents. Toraku nodded in understanding and they left the room to head toward their destination. They were passing by the 7th training ground when Toraku stopped on the path, staring at the destruction a few meters from him. The green and mellow grass in the clearing now looked like a battlefield. A long and thick line of soil crossed it, cutting a deep scar on the surface of the field, only to end in a huge and deep crater. He had sensed it for a while. The scent of his own blood. He gradually moved closer to the scene, walking slowly, step by step, like a robot, all while not avert his gaze from his destination, followed by Minato from a small distance. He was now standing next to the huge crater, eyes locked onto the abyss, where he could still spot some darker points in the soil. His blood, the scent assaulted his sensitive nose and his head started to spin in disgust. This is where? Yes. My team found you here. They were sparring when you suddenly impacted from nowhere. Toraku looked around to gather any crumbs of information, something that maybe he could spot, and also to avert his eyes from the dark spots of his own blood, but nothing grabbed his attention. Not that he really hoped for it, but at least his head stopped spinning for now. My team already complained to the Hokage that they can't use the field in this state. The reconstruction will take weeks. Minato shook his head slowly as he stared inside the hole. Do you remember anything? Toraku shook his head, but he immediately regretted his action. His stomach now lurched like a drum, screaming, and he felt his head starting to spin again. No. Can we go, please? My head is spinning from the scent of my blood. It's just disgusting. Minato looked back at him in disbelief. It happened almost 3 weeks ago, the scene was cleared, and yet he could still smell it even with active chakra-binding seals. He sniffed at the air stealthily, trying to spot the familiar scent of the crimson liquid, but success evaded him. Only the sweet scent of nature caught his nose. The plants, the animals, mixed with the calming sensation of the scent of the wet soil under his foot. He moved next to the blonde, who was now looking down to the center of the pit, and placed his hand on his shoulder. Come on, then. We have things to do. The boy just answered with a nod as they moved towards their real destination, not far away from the start of Toriku's new life in Konoha. They arrived at the next available training ground. Minato moved next to Toriku, pointing to his hands, and he happily freed his wrists from his pockets to present them to the blonde, who then placed his hand on a dark ink seal on his arms to deactivate them. A soft, warm golden light spread across the maze of symbols and it slowly faded away, leaving no mark on his smooth, scar-free skin, only a faint cooling sensation where it was a minute ago. Toriku sighed in relief as he felt his chakra spread across his body, warming up every part, from his head to his toes. It felt pleasant and safe and he really didn't know how he could have lived without this sensation until now. As his chakra filled his system, he subconsciously started to regain his control over it, until it felt natural. He just knew how to do it, and he also knew that he was doing it well. Minato stared at the blonde boy, slowly monitoring the process and nodded in satisfaction as he saw nothing alarming. What about the others? Those will stay for a while. We'll go step by step. I don't want you to overexert your chakra coils, which doubtlessly would happen if I removed all of them at once. I don't want to risk a chakra overcharge on your system. You haven't used it for weeks. At the end I'll remove all of the seals, but for now, focus the amount you currently have access to. Toriku nodded in understanding and moved farther onto the field and started to stretch his limbs automatically. Let's start with a basic chakra control exercise. Minato pointed toward the nearest tree. You are going to climb trees. Toriku rolled his eyes and moved toward the tree confidently as the knowledge sprang up in his mind, and placed his left foot on it to walk up, then his right, only to fall onto his back with a loud thud and a surprised yelp as his head flung backward to meet with the hard soil under the tree. Minato let out a loud laugh, and moved next to the teen, tapping the boy's shoulder as he sat up stroking the back of his head, grunting between his teeth. You knew this was going to happen, don't you? Minato just chuckled. This is because of your stupid seals. They messed up my chakra control. He pointed a finger toward the older blonde with an angry stare. My seals are perfect, and to answer your question, yes, I expected something like this, Minato answered with a sullen voice and folded his arms in front of his chest. Stand up and do it again. He moved to the nearest tree, sat down, and leaned back to watch the still muttering teen. Toriku moved backwards and faced the tree again. A warm, nostalgic feeling flowed through his heart. And he smiled unconsciously. Give me a kunai. Why? To mark my progress. Toriku had caught the flying weapon in midair, faced the tree, and charged without hesitation to run up it, parallel to the ground and then flipped back from its middle, after he marked the height. Not bad for a second try, brat, Minato muttered, while Toriku just frowned back to him, his eyes glaring daggers toward him. I heard that. Sissy. Minato just shook his hand and put his arms behind his head to watch the progress. After 15 minutes Toriku stood upside down on a branch before he jumped down, presenting a perfect black flip and landing fluently on the ground. Minato just pointed towards a small stream at the other side of the training ground and was rewarded with an angry muttering from the teenager. Slave driver. This is boring. Another 10 minutes later, Toriku headed back to Minato, who pointed to the ground beside him, hinting for the teenager to sit down. Minato was actually impressed. The kid shaped up his chakra control in record time. He thought he would only be able to succeed in the tree climbing in the first hour. I'll remove one more set of seals. Do the exercises again and then we can move on to the next step. What will be the next step? Climbing waterfalls? Catching runaway cats? Toraku nattered and looked away while Minato released 2 more seals on his ankles, sending another wave of warming sensation within the blonde, washing away his frustration immediately. No. Sparring. The teen's head flung back toward Minato and he gave an animalistic grin in response. Now it's starting to get interesting. 20 minutes later the 2 blondes stood face to face in the middle of the training ground eyeing their respective opponent, waiting for the other's first move. Minato struck first. He jumped in front of the blonde, aiming a punch to his face, but Toraku naturally brushed his attack to the side and followed up with his other hand to return the favor. Minato crouched to the ground to evade the attack, and launched another one with his right hand toward the teenager's chest. Toraku stepped back to fling his leg toward Minato to avoid his hand. Minato didn't want to hit the blonde hard, he just wanted to see how the blonde would react to their practice fight. And he was doing quite well. His movements became much smoother, much more aware of his surroundings and his own movement after the first 10 minutes. When Minato thought he was ready for the next step, he gracefully jumped backward and smiled in satisfaction at the grinning teen. He tossed a kunai to the teenager who easily caught it in the air and grabbed another one for himself. Then they charged. For 15 minutes nothing could be heard on the training field, only the sharp clinks as metal met metal, the music of a shinobi fight with its sometimes unpredictable, sometimes mystical, and sometimes rhythmic beat. Minato jumped back again, put down his kunai, and gave an appreciative smile to the blonde, breaking the music and leaving the area in an uneasy silence. You know, this went better than I expected. Ready for the next level? Hell yeah, Databayo. Toraku grinned like an idiot. He enjoyed this so much. This was his element. He felt like fish in the water. Out of that small room and fighting. When he fought, everything fell in place, like when you finally find the missing piece of a puzzle. At first it was strange. His limbs moved without him, only pure reflexes handled his attacks and his defense, like he was switched to autopilot. But after the first 10 minutes he was starting to be aware of his own movements, while his only instinct-based movements and actions were fading away slowly during the kunai fight, replaced with direct plans and strategy of how to attack and deflect against his opponent. Minato moved to his side and removed the last seal on his chest, the biggest one, which monitored most of his chakra during the past 2 weeks. As he felt the remaining chakra running through his system, his knees twitched under the sudden pressure, but in the end he managed to stand straight and not drop himself onto the soft grass. He closed his eyes and forced his chakra to calm down as he let out the air in his lungs, slowing his breaths and his heartbeats, to focus on his inner parts. The jumping spikes became smaller and smaller as the raging sea of his blue chakra settled down. The emptiness in his body, in his mind and soul finally filled and he was now whole. At least, almost a whole. He opened his eyes and immediately moved to the nearest tree to check his chakra control. It was perfect for the first try. It was even better than last time. It just felt more familiar, more natural than previously. 2ANBU appeared behind the older blonde, suspiciously eyeing his companion at the top of the tree. They felt those spikes, and their instincts were screaming trouble, when they felt the monstrous amount of chakra and Minato's tensed, ready to attack poise. Everything all right? Minato didn't even bother himself to look at them, he was still staring at the top of the tree, where Toraku stood parallel to the ground examining himself, opening and closing his hands several times. Yeah, I think so. That boy is a chakra monster. Minato just nodded without turning toward the speaker on his right, his own azure pools still focused on the top of the tree, watching carefully every small move and action of Toraku, ready to interfere and put down him if he tried something. Toraku now felt his natural chakra flow, but it lacked any direct control, and he could even feel his blue chakra pulsing from his pores invisibly, numbing his senses. It was disturbing. He closed his eyes again, while he was standing on the highest branch of the tree to suppress it to a more comfortable level, where his senses reached their full potential again, not bothered by his own chakra. He felt the warm breeze waving his shirt, which stroked his skin like a soft hand. He heard the animals around him and smelled their scent around the woods. He let out a deep breath as he opened his eyes and hopped down next to the small group. "Hey, Anbusans, what's this? Free circus? Go back behind that pine." The air between the ANBU members and Toraku tensed, almost to a touchable level, when Minato broke it with his low chuckle. "It's all right. I can handle him." One of the ANBU nodded and left, while the other still stared at the blonde, glaring daggers with his brown eyes behind his mask and his broken pride, but in the end he also left, murmuring about tiresome, cheeky brats behind his mask. "You know, Toraku, they'll have a nervous breakdown because of you." "Why?" the teenager asked with a surprised look. "Because of your sensing skills. You're playing with their nerves the same way a guitarist plucks his strings." The blonde didn't answer, only shrugged. "Can we continue?" They walked to the middle of the clearing, taking up the starting position, ready to attack. This time it was Toraku who launched his attack first. He threw several fast punches toward Minato, but he easily dodged them, only to fling his leg, sweeping the teen's legs out from under him, who was now rolling on the ground in order to gain a more manageable distance from Minato. Toraku jumped to the air towards the blonde and slammed down his leg where Minato stood a blink ago, who was now pointing his kunai to the back of his neck with a smile on his face. "I expected something more from you. Just watch." Toraku disappeared with a puff of smoke, leaving nothing behind but a tree trunk and a wide-eyed Minato. The surprised blonde swung around to find where the blonde moved with the kawarimi, eyeing the training ground around him suspiciously, when he felt a kunai at the back of his head. His muscles tensed to teach the blonde a new lesson about speed, when the two ANBU appeared again with one's kunai at the back of Toraku's head, the other with a katana millimeters in front of his neck. Minato cleared his throat and hissed to the ANBU. "You know, we are sparring, and he is just a teenager, nothing I can't handle easily. You're really overdoing it." "It's okay." Toraku made a sad smile, shrugged and disappeared again with a puff of smoke. Minato frowned as he realized what happened seconds before his sparring partner first disappeared, and a smile appeared on his face as he imagined the open mouths behind the masks. The ground started to move in front of Minato and Toraku appeared slowly from the soil a safe distance away. He straightened himself and swept the soil and dust from his clothes. "Do you know how difficult it was to dig in this damn hard soil, and then position myself to where I want? You just ruined everything." He pointed a finger toward the frozen guards frowning angrily. "Anbusans. Dismiss please, and for Kami's sake, relax a little." The two ANBU disappeared without a trace, still eyeing Toraku suspiciously. "That was a nice job. I thought you used kawarimi to disappear and then reappear behind me at first. The Kage Bunshin used a simple henge and then he transformed back in your blind spot." "I didn't hear anything." Toraku just made a shrug at the comment. He knew the Bunshin should make sound and smoke when it appeared, but he also knew how to make it without anything. That was the first technique that appeared inside his head. He made the Bunshin into the ground without any movement, only by a pure instinct, and when he thought it would be a wise decision to hide, a new idea popped into his mind, to switch places with him with a kawarimi to move underground where the clone was hiding. The same method went through the clone's head as the knowledge of henge popped up in his head underground. "When did you make the Kage Bunshin?" Toraku just grinned as he let out the cheeky answer, earning a high eyebrow from Minato. "Who knows?" Minato frowned at that statement, and also he was angry, because he failed to notice a henge centimeters from himself. An academy-level jutsu. He was aware that something was moving below himself, He could hear the digging under them, and by this he was also aware of the boy's clone, but he suspected an Earth clone. The tactic was priceless, simple, still effective, and Toriku's use of the Kage Bunshin technique was crushing. It was perfect, without any hand signs, noise of any kind, and was channeled directly into the ground. But still, the use of a Kenjutsu technique was a little worrying. So it seems I don't have to hold back as much against you as I first thought. That was a neat move. Toriku just grinned again like an idiot, evidently satisfied with his performance. Once more. Continue with ninjutsu, to regain your knowledge. Toriku became serious and nodded when he heard Minato's simple orders. Minato disappeared, and reappeared at the back of the teenager, and with an inhuman speed he sent him flying toward the trees with a mere flick of his leg. Toriku rolled and jumped back to his feet instantly when he hit the ground, while his hands already formed seals as he rolled. He drew air in his lungs and blew it out to form small fireballs flying towards Minato. Katan, Hozenka no Jutsu. Fire-style art of the phoenix flower. Minato easily dodged the first round, and jumped back carelessly to wait for the fireballs to slam into the ground and disappear where he was a moment before, noting the boy's elemental affinity to himself. Fire was very common in this country. So it seems he is from somewhere nearby, not outside the borders. He sighed in relief within his mind, glad that he wasn't a foreign spy. He snapped out of his thoughts when he felt a chakra spike, just in time to see the blonde had finished the last hand sign of his next attack only moments after he breathed out the last waves of the burning air from his lungs. Futon, Cookie Hanma. Wind release, air hammer. Minato's eyes widened as the small fireballs began to grow to their multiple sizes, then started to whirl and glow like a tornado made of pure fire, flying towards him with increased speed. Minato disappeared from the upcoming impact and reappeared at a nearby tree, watching the deconstruction that the attack caused to the middle of the field. The fire ate large pieces of the field thanks to the wind technique, creating an oven with never-calming hell. He created a collaborate attack to increase the speed and efficiency of his first one. And that was a second affinity. Toriku also sensed his error as he jumped next to the inferno while he was running through a series of seals. Suetun, Daibakufu no Jutsu. Water release, great waterfall technique. A large wave of water spread across the clearing to extinguish the increasing amount of orange and red flames. When the attack died, most of the clearing was black and gray, smoke still twisting lazily in the warm breeze from the ashes of the once green field. Minato tilted his head, to examine the damage but only shrugged. After all, this is what these grounds were for. It may take a month for the grass to grow back, but nothing serious. However, that is a third element, if I don't count the digging, but I'm not sure that was an element use. He looked back at the boy with a curious face. Most of the jonins can handle only 2 elements, the seasoned ones rarely 3. And this boy was only how old? Maybe 18? He shook his head and jumped down to Toriku. You've overdone it a little. This is the second training ground you've reduced to cinders in 2 weeks, stated Minato cheekily. Toriku straightened and scratched the back of his neck. Sorry, it was mostly a reflex. And I didn't do the first willingly. Just how difficult was it for you to use those attacks? Toriku shrugged. Not too much. Can you do a lightning or earth release? I don't know. They just popped up in my head and then I used them. It was a reflex, nothing intentional. Minato nodded and reached into his pocket to reveal a small piece of paper. Here. Channel some chakra to it. You are interested about my main elemental affinity? Exactly. Minato stated cheerfully. Why? Toriku eyed him suspiciously from head to toe. No reason, I'm just curious. Could you just once give me a direct answer? Minato just smiled calmly, but didn't answer. The teenager let out a sigh and grabbed the small paper to channel his chakra into it and turned away from Minato, mumbling about secretive sissies while the blonde moved in front of him to see the process. The paper was sliced into 2 equal parts, and Minato's thoughts wandered to wind country. He really hoped it would burn in the end. So any further explanation why I must do that? Toriku asked. Minato just shrugged, his face wasn't mirroring the disappointment he felt. He wandered back to a tree, still thinking, absolutely lost in his thoughts for minutes. When he finally spoke, Toriku was disappointed. He thought he could stay a little more to polish his skills. We are heading back. That's enough for today. Rest and sleep. Tomorrow's assessment will be a thorough one. Toriku nodded and they headed back to the village, each of them buried within his own thoughts. Minato entered to the Hokage's office to make his report about the assessment, and maybe complain about the ANBU after he escorted Toriku back to the INT department. He hadn't decided yet to mention their previous action. I also have to report the damage to the training ground. He let out a sigh as he sat down in the familiar chair in front of the desk. Hokage-sama. Minato-kun. Any news? I would like to inform you about the details for tomorrow's assessment. I arranged everything. It will be held at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 11th training ground. Sarutobi nodded at the information. I removed all of the chakra binding seals today to prepare him for tomorrow's assessment. Was that a good idea? Minato shrugged. I trust in my instincts. Furthermore, I wanted to have an idea of his capabilities. Sarutobi nodded, and Minato continued. He is quite good. During our little spar he used wind, water and fire releases. Sarutobi blinked in surprise and frowned at the information. That's quite a big elemental repertoire for a teenager. I conducted an element test to see which one was his primary affinity, and the result was wind. It's quite rare in Konoha, so it seems he really was a foreigner. Minato let out a sigh and ran his fingers through his blonde locks. His taijutsu is still sloppy and his ninjutsu techniques were pure reflexes, but this is connected only to his memory loss. It will fade away with time. We were really just scratching the surface of his knowledge. He could be really strong if he regains perfect control. Also, he used quite an interesting tactic. Actually, he surprised me with it. Going only by our brief match, he should be in high chunin or low jonin level, but I'm certain that he is capable of much more than that. Especially considering his chakra system. Who will be his partner? Hatake Kakashi. The Hokage gave him a knowing smile and nodded, kill 2 birds with 1 stone. No, actually not just 2. I think we will see a very interesting match tomorrow. Minato smiled back. This will be a good opportunity for the both of them to show what they are capable of. If you say Toriku was troubled because of the assessment, you would be terribly wrong. He was jumpy and excited, and maybe, a very little bit deeply burrowed inside his mind, a little bit nervous. But only a little bit. He felt like a small child waiting to open the packed box in front of him, to know what's in there. This was his chance to show everyone that he was worthy of their trust, and he could become a useful shinobi. He couldn't hold on, he had to do something to ensure his sanity. He also had the surge to regain more control of his jutsus. He acted on reflexes and it could be dangerous if he involuntarily released a destructive attack. That's it, I can't hold back anymore, I have to talk with Makoto-san. Toriku was now laying in the middle of the ANBU training field, waiting to catch his breath. He got permission from Makoto-san to use the training ground, with ANBU surveillance of course, to continue his preparations. With the lack of a real sparring partner, he used his Kage Bunshins, and he realized he knew a lot more jutsus, and his taijutsu was also morphing from mediocre to a real style. During the approved 2 hours, he also gained control over his reflexes, to avoid another disaster, like with the fire jutsu. He really didn't want to blow up anything like before. A tall blonde figure reached his eyesight. He was on his feet instantly and gave a confused look to the laughing Minato. I didn't sense you. I was around for some time. You know, you aren't the only one with great sensing and chakra control. It isn't a trouble that I was training, was it? No, I gave the permission, and I'm also pleased that you want to regain control over yourself. Anyway, I came to tell you that the assessment will be at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I'll pick you up. But now you really should rest or your partner will mop the ground with blonde locks tomorrow. Toraku nodded and smiled as they left the field together with the 4 ANBU. Toraku was now marching up and down, from wall to wall in his small room. He already fell out with 2 different ANBU because he was frustrated. Yesterday's calm mood was now nowhere to be seen. Only 5 more minutes until 2 o'clock, and that damn Namikaze still isn't here. He was at the point of kicking the door open and marching to the training grounds alone. It wouldn't be so hard to find the Hokage. I'm sure he's surrounded by his ANBU, and these guys just suck. He let out a breath of frustration as he sensed a chakra signature appear behind him, and a hand fall to his shoulder, smelling the familiar scent of the blonde. He breathed in a large amount of air to start yelling, but before he could, Minato smiled and grabbed his shoulder harder. Come on, or we'll be late. Then he felt it. It was like someone grabbed his stomach, then twisted and squeezed it into different angles. It lasted only a second, before it was gone, but that second felt like an eternity when he appeared in a commodious green clearing. His knees buckled and he fell to the ground, but he managed to lean on his hands and now he was panting heavily on all 4s. His face was green, and his dinner was fighting to stay where it was, until he gathered himself, and stared angrily to the blonde, who stood beside him with a stoic face. He straightened on his trembling legs and pointed a finger to the middle of Minato's face, almost touching his forehead, and gathered enough air into his lungs to yell for at least 2 minutes. Without the need to take a break. You freak. How dare you? Never, ever use that thing on me again. I almost died. You're not human. You're a sadist. How the hell can you stand that thing? And what the hell do you think you are even doing? First you were late, I almost broke out to come here alone. If I missed my assessment because of you, I'll kill you. Toraku. Minato said softly but raised an eyebrow at the outburst, but the blonde didn't bother himself and just continued detailing his future torture and his slow and painful death. Then slice you to tinier pieces than your flashy seals and then I'll throw you to the dogs and I'll laugh. And after that I'll... Toraku. Someone cleared his throat in the background and Toraku's brain slowly began to work again after his shock and outburst. He froze and slowly turned toward a small group of people. He felt Minato's palm snap to the back of his head, not in a painful way, but in a I told Atalistantamien Naluquatio Ave done way. His brain fell apart and he had felt his blood moving to his face, burning it like all hell. His cheeks and forehead, even his ears were now brilliantly red in embarrassment as he faced an older man in a white and red robe, with a triangle-shaped hat on his head, stoically puffing from his pipe while eyeing him from head to toe without showing any emotion as he watched the scene. On his left, a smaller boy stood, with spiky silver hair and only one visible wide eye. The other was hidden under his hitayat, as was his lower face with a mask. He tilted his head to the side as he admired the unusual scene. Toraku lifted his hand behind his head to scratch the back of his head in a familiar way. Sorry. For the scene. Can we pretend that the last 5 minutes never happened? He smiled in embarrassment to the leader of the village, and when he received a smile in return, he gathered himself and bowed toward the man. Hokage-sama. It's pleasure to meet you in person. Sarutobi smiled at him, and he never, ever wanted to admit it loudly, but he understood his outburst. Minato played a nasty trick, and experiencing the Hiration for the first time really wasn't pleasant. Torakuken. Also my pleasure. However, we already met once before in the hospital under a different situation. Also, very sorry about that. Torakuken, let me introduce you to Jonin Hatake Kakashi. He is one of my students. Minato moved his hand toward the young boy, who just nodded in response. Toraku gave one last angry glance toward the other blonde and nodded in response to Kakashi. Hatake-kun. He looked back to Minato with a questioning look. Who will I fight with? Minato pointed toward the silver-haired child and Toraku raised one eyebrow at the gesture, but didn't make any comment. They were now eyeing each other suspiciously until Minato broke the silence. Now, if the introductions are done, we can start the assessment. The rules are the following. This is just a spar, no use of deadly force. Limit your fight to the clearing and hold back on the use of any destructive jutsu. During the last part he was meaningfully eyeing Toraku. The two boys nodded and moved to the center of the clearing to start the fight after the approval, while their two audience members moved to the side of the training ground. Begin! Minato shouted. The two boys instantly charged at each other, starting with mere taijutsu to survey each other's strength and speed and to warm up. Toraku launched his left hand toward Kakashi's left eye under his hitayat, while he deflected his attack with his other hand, sweeping it to the side from his face. The young Jonin jumped backward with a flip while moving his legs to perform a kick under the blonde's chin successfully. The blonde's head snapped backward, and he immediately jumped to the same direction to gain some space. Toraku shook his head to clear his thoughts and examined again his opponent with narrowed eyes. Kakashi ran toward his opponent, sending punches, aiming for the blonde's head, who was now forced again to deflect back continuously from the rain of punches. The Jonin jumped over him to aim a kick for his back, but Toraku crouched and rolled to the slide to avoid it. Minato watched the battle with narrowed eyes. Toraku used a mix of several styles, different from his small spar yesterday, and it had a lot of familiar components. Gentle Fist, Basic Academy, Gentle Fist, something else, Gentle Fist again, Advanced Academy, Tiger, Hard Fist, something else, Tiger again, Gentle Fist. It was a big chaotic mess, with effective defense and unpredictability. However, he couldn't catch up with Kakashi, hadn't even used his Sharingan yet. Some moves were definitely based on the Hyuga's Gentle Fist. Not the same, but very similar. How on earth did he manage to learn that? They guard their tradition like a pack of wild dogs. No way they would teach it to an outsider, doesn't matter if he's from Konoha, or from another country. I even doubt they would teach it to Sarutobi. Minato glanced toward his leader, who also narrowed his eyes in recognition. Toraku rolled further from the young shinobi and he took up once more the starting position as Kakashi had done the same 5 meters from the blonde. Toraku was now waiting for his attack, which wasn't long. A second later, Kakashi jumped into the air and sent 3 kunai flying toward him. He jumped to the side to avoid the attack, and grabbed one of them to deflect the second wave of flying shuriken with his newly gained weapon. Hey! I don't have any weapons. Toraku yelped to Minato, who just shrugged and chuckled. If looks could kill, Minato would be dead in at least 50 various and painful ways. The teen's head snapped back to the fight just in time to deflect another wave of kunai flying toward him. He muttered angrily, but he grabbed one of the kunai in the air, followed its movement as he spun himself gracefully, like a dancer, and sent it back to Kakashi with increased speed without a break in the flow. He jumped back and without any hand sign, he stated calmly the name of the next technique. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Shadow Clone Jutsu. A Bunshin appeared next to him without smoke or sound and immediately transformed into a Fuma Shuriken after he nodded to the original blonde. Toraku grabbed and sent it towards Kakashi in a flash, however he easily jumped away from its path. The blonde narrowed his eyes and repeated his previous move. Tajukage Bunshin no Jutsu, multiple shadow clone technique. This time around 50 clones appeared and jumped toward the original to transform into several weapons, sticking into the soil, ready to be grabbed. The ground around the blonde was now filled with shurikens, kunai, katanas, chains and everything that was able to cause damage in various forms from senbons to even a war axe. Toraku grabbed them one by one and threw them towards the young shinobi without hesitation, only to be deflected easily by Kakashi. Sarutobi made a disappointed look and frowned at the scene, narrowing his eyes to a line. The taijutsu was something very unexpected, though not enough to counter Kakashi. The mix of styles, and the gentle fist. Not the exact copy, but certainly based on it. Maybe he tried to copy it from a Hyuga. The question is, where could he at all have had the opportunity to do that? When he first saw Toraku using Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, a kinjutsu, forbidden for the shinobi and very dangerous without using a hand sign, without smoke or sound, only to create weapons, he was impressed. But now, he saw that the boy was just throwing them without thinking, more and more desperately, and that disappointed him. Minato talked about him with pride as a skilled shinobi. He looked to his friend, who was still focused carefully to the fight. Hiruzen raised an eyebrow when Minato looked at him and gestured his head toward the boys, signaling to just watch the fight. Toraku was out of weapons, panting and with sweat pouring from his forehead. The ground was filled with the weapons all across the field as Kakashi jumped all around to avoid them. His eyes were still fixed on Kakashi, while the young shinobi exploited the lack of weapon rain and jumped toward him to launch his final attack at the exhausted ninja. He jumped backward, playing a cat-and-mouse game with him, until Kakashi finally grabbed his wrist, twisted it painfully backwards and slammed his body to the ground, placing his foot inside the blonde tufts. Kakashi snorted in victory when his captive disappeared in a puff of smoke, chuckling. Sarutobi raised an eyebrow, while Minato made a wide smirk. He already knew what would happen. Toraku jumped out from the ground and aimed a kick toward Kakashi, who deflected it with wide eyes, jumped back and grabbed a kunai from the ground, which transformed and a new Toraku appeared beside him, aiming for his head with a punch. Kakashi was surprised that the blonde was fast. Faster than before, and he hadn't had time to react. When his fist connected with his head, he flew across the field, but at the last second he was able to twist in the air and land on his feet. Two more clones appeared on each side from a kunai and from a senbon, slamming a kick together from each side to his back, sending Kakashi flying again toward another group of sneering blonde boys. The scene reminded Sarutobi of a crazy flipper game, and his mouth curled into a smile. The boy was, in the end, really good. The tactic was so simple, but still great, and Kakashi underestimated his opponent. After two more flying lessons he was finally able to twist in midair to land in a place without any blonde head or suspicious weapons. He looked at Minato, who gave a nod as his approval. The army of blonde shinobi was now waiting patiently after they fulfilled their duty. Kakashi reached up to his hitayat and revealed his left eye. A red glowing eye with two lazily whirling black tomo. The Toraku clones froze, then tilted their head to examine the new danger with wide eyes in an almost complete synchronization. One of the blondes in front of Kakashi grabbed his head, and made a painful grimace while most of the mini-army and weapons still into the soil disappeared in a puff of smoke with a groan. Toraku was now kneeling on one leg while he tried to focus his eyes anywhere else beside the red eyes. He shook his head to see Kakashi was now glancing toward their audience with a confused face. "Well, I think the Sharingan theory is proven," Minato stated calmly, and Sarutobi nodded in agreement. The older blonde appeared next to the boy's crouching form, examining him suspiciously, waiting for him to grab himself. He shook his head again and straightened. "What happened?" "I'm okay, I want to continue." "You remembered something?" Minato's voice was now cold and professional. "Nothing. Really. Just a feeling, like when we ate recently." He shook his head again to clear his thoughts. "It was rage, but a very intensive one. But I'm okay now. Really. I want to continue." Minato nodded and appeared again next to the Sandame. You know, you're pretty good, Kakashi stated with a little edge in his voice. The blonde smiled. Thanks. You too. Toriku's thoughts wandered back to a minute ago. Rage. He felt the kind of rage that could blow up a mountain. He knew that this feeling was toward a certain person. But, there were other emotions. Protection, caring. And a promise. Toriku narrowed his eyes and forced himself back to his task in front of him. They started charging toward each other, running through hand signs. Katan, Gokakyu no Jutsu, fire release, great fireball technique, they shouted out in unison, exactly the same time. When the two infernos met, it spread burning hot flames around the ground, burning a great expanse of the ground to black and gray ashes. Toriku shouted out to Minato, while he pointed toward Kakashi. Please note, that this wasn't my fault. He was the one who copied my technique, so this mess doesn't belong to me. Minato just shook his head briefly and nodded. He turned toward his opponent and started running toward Kakashi, as a shadow clone appeared next to him, also running. The young boy didn't wait for him to use any attack, as he formed a hand sign to stop the blonde. Katan, Gokakyu no Jutsu, fire release, great fireball technique, the clone grabbed Toriku's fist and sent him flying toward Kakashi with increased speed, avoiding the fireball just in time to disappear in a puff of smoke inside the unstoppable inferno. Toriku landed in front of Kakashi and slammed his hands toward the boy, who immediately jumped backward to avoid the punch, which almost reached his chest. However, despite his active Sharingan, he couldn't calculate what happened next. Two blue mini-chakra tornadoes appeared in the palms of the blonde, and immediately stretched toward him, sending him flying to the trees and into the woods, to stop after he broke 3 trees with his small body. All of this in only the blink of an eye. Futon, Tatsumaki Odori, wind release, tornado dance. The blonde murmured the name of the technique, which was performed without any hand sign, or warning, just appeared in a blink of time. Toriku waited for the young jonin to appear stoically, but suddenly he swung around and smashed his fist into the ground to pull out a blinking Kakashi by his wrist and pointed a kunai toward his throat, expanded with sharp wind chakra. I guess this fight is mine. We will see. Kakashi in his hands exploded into millions of electronic sparks, sending lightning toward his limbs, but before the lightning clone could finish his task, he vanished in a puff of smoke again. 2 forms exploded from the ground, sending dust and debris all over the field. Kakashi already started making hand signs. I have to finish this quick or he will be troublesome. The blonde pushed his hands toward him, but nothing happened. Kakashi froze in his movement, preparing the same attack as before, his muscles tensed ready to avoid the attack. He won't fail twice by the same mistake, he will be prepared. At least he thought, but he was pushed back with an enormous wind blast that appeared from nowhere and without any sign. He fell to the ground, but before he could react, and jump to his feet, another enormous wind blast reached him from the sky, nailing him onto the ground continuously, while Toriku stepped toward him stoically. Kakashi still struggled, but the wind was too strong. He couldn't even leave his eyes open as the enormous air pressure pinned him to the ground. Futon, Cookie Hanma, wind release, air hammer, stated the blonde calmly, glancing down at his still struggling captive. You won't be able to escape from this, so I suggest you forfeit. However, Kakashi ignored him, and he gave up only after 2 minutes of massive struggling against the wind pressure. Toriku released the jutsu, and stepped next to Kakashi, giving a helping hand to him, to get up. Minato also appeared with the Hokage, smiling at the 2 boys with awe. You made quite a nice show, boys. Yeah, and gained quite a big audience also. Toriku grunted, pointing towards the trees and toward a big cliff, where Inoichi and Makoto sat. Minato chuckled, while he sensed the disappearance of 10 chakra signals from the woods and 1 more approaching from Inoichi's direction. Umbu. They were really curious as to what the boy was capable of besides playing with their pride. You didn't use hand signs with the wind techniques or the bunshins, Kakashi pointed out the obvious. Well, no. I don't want any of my wind techniques to be copied by you. After you did that with my fireball, I thought it would be safer for me like this. Kakashi narrowed his eyes, and suddenly one more Toraku appeared next to them. Okay guys, good job. The one who helped up Kakashi saluted toward them with 2 fingers, grinning, then disappeared with a puff of smoke, and more could be heard all over the battlefield as the last of the weapons and still lurking clones disappeared. I was beaten by a clone. If Kakashi wasn't as composed as he was, he would have liked to grab his silver hair and tear it out. A mere clone. That's a shame. You are lazy, Minato stated with a calm tone, but a small hint of awe was also in his voice. I just wanted to say hi to Inoukazan and Makoto-san. Mostly I was fighting. Toraku just shrugged and waved toward the 2-man group on the cliff. How many of those did you make, exactly? Asked Minato curiously. Enough to have fun for at least 1 more hour. Toraku grinned when he saw Kakashi's widening eyes. Sarutobi puffed from his pipe and turned to them. I have to admit, that was a really interesting fight. Minato, we will meet in my office at 6 o'clock. I would like to have a word with the young man. Minato nodded and waved a hand when he disappeared with a yellow flash of his blonde locks. Toraku shivered from the sight as the memory flowed into his mind, almost feeling again when it was used on him, earning a small smile from the Hokage. Kakashi bowed to the leader and nodded to Toraku, then teleported away, leaving whirling leaves and dust on the training ground. Sarutobi turned to Toraku, eyeing him with a wondering look on his wrinkled face. Let's take a walk, Torakukan. The blonde nodded. He was now nervous as the adrenaline from the previous fight faded away, leaving him alone with the strongest man in the village. He knew that this talk would occur eventually. Actually, he thought it would be much sooner. They started to walk slowly back to the village on the small path without a word. The blonde felt himself very uneasy, pressed by the awkward silence. What should I do? Should I ask something? Before he could decide and act, Sarutobi broke the silence between them. Why do you want to stay in Konoha? Toraku left his gaze at the ground while they walked, kicking a small stone out of his way. Despite my first experience, I like it here. He looked back at Sarutobi and continued. Most of the people are nice. Except some of the ANBU. They are quite jumpy. His eyes wandered toward the woods, where the Hokage's private guards followed their movement until now without a noise. A groan left one of the trees with a familiar voice, mumbling with irritation. For his surprise, Sarutobi leaned back his head and laughed loudly. After he finished, he waved a hand toward Toraku to continue. It's peaceful here. I know there is war outside the walls, but still, that's how I feel. Besides, I don't really know where else I could go. I don't know anybody. He smiled sadly toward the Hokage, who nodded in understanding. Why do you want to become a shinobi? This is the only thing I know. And I'm aware that some of my skills could serve the village well. Besides, I thought a lot about my memories. About my only memory. He locked his eyes to the ground again. I thought a lot. And I don't want to remember the rest of them. I don't want to feel that sorrow again, just like when I regained my first and only memory. I want to protect the people I know and care about, so I don't have to feel that again. Even if that means only one person. I want to start it over. His sentence died to a low voice, almost whispering. He felt his cheeks start to warm up in his embarrassment. He hadn't shared these thoughts with anyone else besides Minato, who was actually the only one now who could be called his friend. Or something like that. It feels like, I belong here. He shrugged and looked down again to find another stone to channel his frustration into. I understand. The Hokage nodded, but his eyes locked onto him curiously. What will be your goal here? The blonde stopped as he thought about the question, and answered with a wide smile. I want to build a better future. For his amusement, the old leader of the village flung his head back and laughed again in a Naruto Hokage-like fashion. Now he didn't look like the old, tempered leader of the village. He seemed to feel more rejuvenated than he had felt in decades, and his deep wrinkles smoothed out on his face as he laughed. Torakuken, you never set low standards for yourself, do you? The blonde responded with a small, embarrassed smile, scratching his cheek while he started waking again. I'll let you join our ranks, but be aware, gaining our trust will be a long and difficult path. Toraku's head turned toward the Hokage, his eyes filled with gratefulness. Thank you, Hokage-sama. I won't disappoint you. The blonde gave a deep bow, his chest parallel to the ground, smiling wide. He started straightening himself, but he suddenly froze during the movement, his face straightened and his eyes narrowed. He caught a small movement from the edge of his eyesight. Sarutobi tensed, as he also sensed an almost unsensible killing intent reaching them. It was so small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. The blonde jumped toward a tree where the nearest ANBU hid not even a meter from them, and to Sarutobi's surprise he wrenched as much kunai as he could with one hand from the ANBU's pouch and immediately sent them flying behind Sarutobi. All of that only in a blink of an eye. In another blink of an eye Toraku was now laying on the ground on his stomach, 3 ANBU above him, his arms painfully twisted behind his back, one leg on his head, and one knee on his back, pinning him painfully to the ground while his head was pulled backward by his hair, with katana in front of his neck a millimeter from his throat. He grunted in pain, eyeing behind the Hokage. Sarutobi was now standing in a calm but still tensed fighting pose, with a black staff in his hand, pinning a shapeless, panting something to one of the trees meters from him with the weapon, surrounded by the rest of the ANBU team pointing various weapons to the still invisible intruder. As the veil faded away slowly with a waving movement, like seeing something under the water, a shape of a shinobi appeared in front of them. Sarutobi eyed the ninja, resting his narrowed eyes on the 5 kunai, which was nailing the intruder's clothes to the 3 millimeters from his body. A perfect hit. He waved his hand towards the group pinning Toraku down. Let the boy go. The ANBU shared a hesitating look, but then they moved away from the teen, eyeing him suspiciously while he moved to his feet, rubbing his aching wrist after their forced position. The intruder's eyes locked onto the teen, watching him in rage, and didn't even bother to restrain his killing intent sent toward the blonde. Sarutobi narrowed his eyes more, if that was even possible, surveying the attacker. His eyes moved to his hitayat with the symbol of Iwagakure. Bring him to the interrogation and torture department. The eye of the captive swept towards the Hokage for the first time, and a small hint of panic appeared on his face. The ANBU disappeared in the blink of an eye together with the IWA ninja, leaving Sarutobi, Toraku and the rest of the guards without a sound. The old man now turned toward Toraku, studying him in wonder. One step closer, Torakuken. One step closer. The Hokage smiled at him and left the shocked teen on the path alone with his thoughts. Toraku had been staring after the vanishing silhouette of the Sandaime Hokage for long minutes from the exact same spot. Damn, he's strong. He couldn't recall when he had drawn out the staff or when he moved to use it. The old man was still fast and incredibly powerful. But he was glad. After he saw the ANBU and the Hokage in action, he was sure that his actions were unnecessary, even if he had sensed the intruder a millisecond before them. After a last shrug, Toraku made his way towards his room on the narrow path, back to the village. He was lost in his thoughts about the previous fight with Kakashi. He managed it much better than he first thought he would, but a new feeling bothered him. That enormous rage that he felt. What if the same thing happened during a real mission and he froze in the middle of a life-and-death situation when facing with a strong and dangerous opponent, or if his feelings overwhelm him while he is facing with a friend during a sparring match? He couldn't let that happen again. He had to harden himself and lock away everything from his old self, to prevent a future catastrophe. As he was walking towards the village, he suddenly stopped and flung his head up when he had realized. He was alone. He was alone outside of his room, for the very first time since he had woken up in the hospital. Okay, not perfectly alone, but besides only one ANBU hiding 10 meters from him behind a cliff, he was almost alone. A smile appeared on his features and a warm sensation filled his chest. A sensation of his first steps to gain their trust. With this last thought he continued his trip toward the village, smiling and enjoying the nature around him and the warm breeze as it gently stroked his whisker marks on his cheeks. Sarutobi looked up from the long and irritating scroll in front of him to answer a knock on the door. He already waited for his arrival and he wasn't surprised when he first sensed the familiar chakra signal. "Come in, Minato." "Sarutobi-sama." He bowed and approached him with graceful and confident steps. "I heard what happened." "Yes. I already received a short summary about the interrogation. Inoikazan is a very efficient shinobi. It seems that our guest from IWA was originally a spy, but he couldn't contain his emotions too well. However, his hiding skills are extraordinary." Minato gave a confused look to the Hokage. His mission was only observation, nothing more. Inoichi revealed that his younger brother died during your last mission in IWA. When he saw Toraku, he thought he was your relative and he couldn't suppress his killing intent. Sarutobi shook his head and looked into the wide cerulean eyes of Minato. "That's true that we look very alike, but that's ridiculous." Minato frowned and slowly shook his head. "You not only look alike, but you have more in common than you think, Minato." Sarutobi's eyes darkened after the statement, which started to bother Minato like hell. He hated when he behaved like this, hinting and not spilling out what he knew. "What do you mean by that?" Minato frowned, his eyes narrowed as Sarutobi had sighed and pulled out a drawer to grab its contents. He slowly eyed the thick file in his hand, sighed again, and after a minute of hesitation he finally handed it over to Minato. Then he touched and channeled some chakra into carved pattern on the desk to activate the privacy seals of his office. "You would learn about it later anyway, but I wanted to inform you on my terms. After this incident I can't delay it anymore." Minato's eyebrow raised. He wasn't used to this side of Sarutobi. He was in the position of his trust, but now he was hiding something very important. He looked at the file in his hand, hesitating for a moment before opening it. It was Toraku's personal file with every bit of information they were able to gather after his arrival. A small picture of the smiling teen was at the top right corner of first page above the report. He had eyed the picture for a moment, before his eyes moved down and started carefully reading its content. Original name, unknown. Code name, Odoroki Toraku, gender, weight, height, special, identifications. Found belongings. Hospital reports. Known skills. Etc. Relatives. Test subject 14 confirmed. Minato looked up to meet Sarutobi's darkened eyes, but his azure ones were now filled with confusion. While the thoughts were forking in his head like lightning, he gathered his emotions. He already knew the answer, but he wanted to hear it from the Hokage's own mouth. "Who is test subject 14? He asked calmly without any hint of his frustrating thoughts. Sarutobi watched him seriously, and puffed from his never-missing pipe before he stated calmly, "You." Sarutobi eyed him without motion, waiting for some kind of reaction from the blonde, but when no answer came he continued in the same calm tone. "According to the tests, he is a very close relative. A first generation, like father, son, or brother." Minato just stared at the file in his hands without any reaction. He had been hardening his emotions and forced himself to observe the situation and the file in his hands like a professional, caring only for the facts. We can easily assume that the first two options aren't possible, so that leaves only one left. He is your brother, or more likely your half-brother. I doubt that you would forget your mother's pregnancy, so the only option is an affair of your father. By the age gap, it was one of his last acts, Minato stated with a sour tone, but still calmly. He already knew what would be the next step of this game. You know what this could mean, Minato, don't you? If his memory was erased purposely to infiltrate into Konoha and be near you, if he is here only because of you. This is a dangerous situation for the village. Are you prepared for the decision that is expected? Minato only nodded slowly, his face showing no emotion, then he finally closed his eyes and shook his head, and his calm mask started to crack. Yes, it could be. But what if he isn't? If his appearance here is only coincidence? What do you expect of me? That I should kill him? That I should execute a teenager, who could be my only living relative? Minato's calm was starting to fade away. Of course he had been suspecting, and was also aware about the hints, that maybe there was more to this teen and that maybe they were somehow connected in some way. He wasn't blind. But as the Hokage had hinted the execution of the boy, it just made his eyes twitch. I don't like to repeat myself, Hiruzen. But if we execute him now, that would make us merciless killers and nothing more. The Hokage didn't bother himself about the casual address, he just eyed the blonde in front of him curiously. In the near future you will have to make decisions like this. I know that very well. But you are you, and I am I. We are different and I won't sacrifice anyone without any real proof, based only on speculations. And I doubt you are also that kind of person. Minato's voice died lower as he grabbed himself and calmed his aching nerves again. I take full responsibility for his actions. He wants to belong to this village and he wants to become a shinobi. Assign him to my team, that way I can keep an eye on him continuously, and accommodate him next to my apartment. I'll do what I have to do, if the time comes, for the sake of the village, but as of now this isn't that time. Sarutobi didn't break the connection of their eyes, nor the silence which settled down in the office. He eyed Minato's every small movement, reaction, waiting for a tiny hint, but he was determined. In some aspects he was right. The boy at the moment wasn't a threat, and he was also determined to serve the village. Toraku was an impetuous boy who couldn't hide his emotions. And today he also experienced the strange aura that surrounded the boy. He hadn't laughed as freely as he did in the afternoon since the war had started. During that time, he felt like he moved back in time decades, where he was without the weight of the problems, the war, the continuous worrying for his people. Sarutobi closed his eyes, puffing continuously from his pipe, filling the room with the smell and smoke of the lazily smoldering fine tobacco, while his thoughts gathered around the choices. Finally, he opened his eyes to meet a calm, blue ocean in front of him, then he just simply nodded in consent. He sensed Minato's fully tensed muscles relax, and his expression warmed as he gave a bow. Thank you, Hokage-sama. Do you want to inform Toraku about your relation? Minato nodded without hesitation and looked back at the door. He felt the boy's chakra signature behind the doors for some time past. Sarutobi touched another small seal on the surface of his desk without a word to signal to his secretary. When the doors opened, the blonde teenager stepped in, escorted by an ANBU. The Hokage nodded to the guard, who bowed and left the room without a word. Toraku also bowed and moved nervously toward the desk where the two men were watching him calmly and knowingly, hesitant of what to say next. Then Minato sent a small, warm smile at him and pointed to the chair next to him to sit down, and he was more than thankful to accept the offer to escape from this awkward situation. Torakuken. We are here to discuss some very important matters about your future in Konoha. The Hokage said this with a moderate tone, and Toraku tensed in the chair. You will be accommodated next to Minato-kun's apartment in the future. You can move there tomorrow morning. The blonde relaxed a little and nodded, waiting patiently for the old man to finish his words. Also, you will be assigned to Minato-kun's team. The Hokage moved to his right and pulled out a drawer, placing a hitayat in front of him on the desk, still eyeing the teen. Sarutobi pointed toward the hitayat and Toraku reached after it, like a child for a piece of candy. His azure irises sparked in awe as he stared at the headband, studying every small part and every detail of it before he tied it on his forehead. He couldn't stand it, a small smile left his mouth and the heavy air in the office disappeared. Welcome to our lines, Chunin Odoroki Toraku. The blonde grinned again like an idiot. His mouth was spread from ear to ear, but suddenly confusion ran across his face. Chunin? I beat the crap out of the shrimp and he's a jonin. Why should I be his inferior? Minato let out a loud laugh at his statement, still chuckling afterward while everyone else waited for him to control himself. He had cleared his throat and looked back at his newly found relative with a calm face. That is because we don't know anything about your previous experience. Your power and skills may be on jonin level, but this isn't all about power. With time you can gain that rank. Now it was time for Sarutobi to chuckle at the blonde, who was now sitting in the chair with folded arms around his chest, his legs crossed, and frowning at Minato, sending angry looks toward him. He was sulking, just like a kid. It was very unpleasant that merely 10 minutes ago they were talking about the execution of the very same boy in front of them. Be patient, Toraku-kun. Furthermore, there is one more thing that we must discuss before you start active duty with the rest of your team. Toraku straightened in the chair and now he was looking curiously at the Hokage, who waved for Minato to continue. We found a relative of yours here in Konoha. Toraku's eyes widened, his head switching from man to man, to settle down again on Minato. How? Who? These were the only two words he could process from himself in his surprise. We conducted a blood test, and one was positive. Who is it then? When can we meet? Minato now scratched the back of his head nervously, not sure how to continue. Well, you already know him. It looks like you are half-brothers, based on the test results. I have a brother. And I know him? Toraku's eyes widened to an unnatural size, his thoughts running in his head at an insane speed. Brother, so we must be alike. There's only two blonde who I know, but Inoichi is. He looked back at Minato with a confused, but knowing look. No way. Well, trust me, this is as unexpected for me as for you. I've also only just found out myself. Toraku frowned as the previous statement's background started to become clearer. At first he thought that they placed him around Minato because he only knew him, and of course to keep an eye on him. But now, he was a little bit disappointed. After the first 10 minutes of ecstasy, that he would be a real shinobi, he would be able to leave that room, and that he had family. It seemed distant now. You still think that I'm a spy? Or an assassin? Someone after Minato, don't you? He asked with a sad smile on his face. Indeed, Sarutobi stated calmly. Remember what I told you, Toraku-kun. Trust is something that you can earn with time and hard work. And I know that you are aware that your presence is more than suspicious. Toraku had nodded and stood up, his eyes filled with determination, and he bowed again just like hours before toward the two men. He looked up, and smiled at the old man at the table, then to Minato. I won't disappoint you. And I never go back on my word. That is my nindo. Minato smiled at the pleasant sight and he was really glad that this sentiment remained from the boy's previous life. Sarutobi nodded in response. You can go now. I'm sure there is a lot you two wanted to talk about. The two blondes nodded and stood up, while Minato grabbed his arm. Come on, I'll give you a lift. No, why? The two blondes disappeared from the room and Sarutobi was sure that the soundproof walls of the interrogation and torture department wouldn't be enough to restrain the yells of Toraku. I hope you made a good decision, Minato. When the two blondes appeared at the interrogation and torture department in the middle of Toraku's room, he was surprised. Surprised that he wasn't going to die. He was panting heavily, a little bit shaky, but not as bad as it was the first time when that bastard used Hiration on him. He looked at Minato, still angry, but more confused, and he just made a grin in return. It always gets better and better. I don't even feel anything, but for the first 10 times I looked much worse than you for your first time. I had to lay down after I lost my lunch. How does it work? There is a seal in your room. I used that to have one base point as the destination and my starting point to another. I use a time-space ninjutsu to transport myself between the 2 points. Actually, it's much more trickier than that, but something like that in short. Toraku's anger flashed away and they sat down on the bed side by side without a word. An awkward silence fell upon them, but neither of the blondes dared to break it. Neither of them knew what they should say to the other. Finally, Toraku opened his mouth. You know, I don't think I previously had anybody as a parent figure, or a brother. Minato just raised an eyebrow at the statement. Why do you think that? Because, when I need certain knowledge it pops up. And now, when I'm looking for something about a family, there's nothing. Minato smiled at Toraku. Then, it's time for the both of us to learn something new. The blonde teenager smiled back, but the silence came back between them. What should I call you? Well, I would really appreciate that within the team, you call me sensei like the others. But beyond that, time will make that decision for us. Well then, sensei, you'll be teaching me, right? Minato raised a suspicious eyebrow at the blonde. Well, yeah. Then teach me that teleportation technique. Minato just stared at him in disbelief, then burst out laughing. Why? I thought you hated it. Toraku just rolled his eyes while his company still chuckled. Yeah, that's true, but it seems very useful too. In time. It's not an easy technique, you know. Besides, Kushina would kill me if I taught it to you before her. Who is she? You know, she's my girlfriend. Minato shuffled on the bed a little. Anyway, pack anything you want, and rest now. You had a long day, and so did I. I'll get you tomorrow morning and you can move into the apartment. And also prepare for some introductions. The blonde got up from the bed and started to wave goodbye when he was stopped. Minato. Yeah. Thanks. For what, exactly? For everything. Minato looked confused, but when he saw Toraku's wide grin, he just mimicked it and waved his hand, then disappeared in a flash of gold, leaving the teen alone in his small room. The blonde leaned back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, still grinning. He was happy. Really happy. The next morning came with record speed. Not that Toraku had too many things to pack, but still way too fast. Minato told him yesterday that he would introduce him to people, and he was sure that those would be his girlfriend and the team. He really wanted to make a good first impression, and now as he looked into the small mirror in the bathroom with his bed hair, he couldn't do anything else but grimace at his image when he felt the familiar chakra signature appear outside the room. A minute later a blonde head peeked inside the slightly opened bathroom door. Morning. Are you ready? Just minute, he answered casually while fighting with his spiky hair, which now pointed in every direction it shouldn't. You know, I think you just made it worse. Toraku sent an angry look toward Minato, then he ruffled his hair in his frustration. Still the same. Arg. I don't care. Let's go. Anything to carry? No, everything's in my pocket. Then let's get out of here. Minato placed his hand onto Toraku's shoulder to disappear in a blink, leaving the white room behind. They were now standing in front of a light orange door. Toraku shook his head, and placed his still trembling left hand onto his forehead when uneasy groan left his soft lips as he felt the way softer side effect of the technique, while Minato pushed a small metal key into his other. Here. You're first. Toraku stared down into his palm, examining the small key in his hand and smiled as the cold key started to take over his body heat, until he could only feel the curves of the metal. He pushed it into the keyhole, turning slowly, enjoying every moment of his first step into his new life. The apartment was small but still much bigger and inviting than his small hole before. It had a normal-sized sitting room with a table and a smaller couch, an open kitchen, and there was also a very small eating corner. He walked around to find out where the other two doors lead. He found a small bathroom and a bedroom with a single bed, but what caught his eye were the empty shelves, which filled the whole wall from corner to corner with a small desk in front of it. Toraku approvingly nodded at the sight and immediately tried out his new bed. It was nice and comfortable. He looked toward the small window, which let the sunbeams into his room, revealing millions of slowly dancing dust motes. Minato leaned against the door frame, watching as the teenager relaxed on his new bed. I spoke with Saratobi-sama this morning. They furnished the apartment with some stuff, but he also sent this. Minato gave a small envelope to the lying Toraku, who was now watching him curiously. What's this? This is an allowance, to cover your first month's costs until you can earn enough from the missions. We will need to buy some stuff. Like equipment, clothes, and food. I thought after this we could start with a small introduction, then get that stuff before you meet the rest of the team. Toraku nodded as he stood up to face with Minato, when he felt the familiar touch on his shoulder and they appeared in a different room. Toraku shook his head and touched his forehead to calm down his slowly spinning brain. I thought that you lived next door, he muttered while he was still rubbing his temporal. Indeed, yes. Toraku's eyes widened. You can't be serious, using that move a distance less than 10 meters to the side, can you? Minato just shrugged while he was walking toward the kitchen and grabbed a glass. Juice? Toraku just watched him in disbelief. You're a lazy bastard. I'm sure that the whole town is filled with your shit. I'm sure even every room of this apartment is filled with it, actually. I like this guy. Toraku spun around to meet a wildly grinning woman, with long, ruby-red hair, leaning against a door frame with her hands folded around her waist. He was too busy scolding Minato to sense her presence. It's nice to meet you, Toraku-kun. I heard a lot about you. And yes, he is a lazy bastard who can't even walk to the toilet at night. He'd rather use his Hiration. Minato only rolled his eyes in annoyance from the kitchen, moving a hand toward the woman. Toraku-kun, let me introduce Uzumaki Kushina. The teen stared at her in disbelief, his eyes wide and he felt his mouth fall open. He spirited away from the small room, from Konoha, from the fire country, away from everything, inside his mind, where a foggy picture flew tenderly inside his thoughts. Someone smiling at him, but he couldn't see her well, only the soft silhouette. A voice of a woman, full of love and care, distant, but still soft and heartwarming, echoed in his mind. I love you. Everything all right? Toraku shook his head to clear his thoughts and smiled at the ruby-haired beauty in front of him. Yes, thank you. It's nice to meet you too. I'm Todoroki Toraku. He bowed politely, then tilted his head still examining the girl in front of him, rambling away again. What? Is there something on my face? No. I was just admiring your hair. Kushina immediately tensed at the statement, narrowing her eyes. What about my hair? It's just beautiful. The hard expression immediately melted away from Kushina's face, replaced with a familiar soft, warm smile as she moved toward the boy to place a soft kiss on his forehead. I really like you. If Toraku ever felt himself embarrassed, he was wrong. His whole face, even his ears were now burning like an inferno, melting away his tanned skin, which glowing now within bright crimson color. She turned toward Minato, who was leaning against the dining table, his eyes narrowed at the previous scene. "Hey Torakuken. As the introductions are now over, let's get going. We have a lot of things to do." "Where are you going?" "Shopping." "And no way you can come. I want to finish it fast and I think so does he." Kushina didn't answer, just stuck out her tongue and walked away to hop down on the couch. But she still sent a warm smile toward the still brilliant red young teenager. Minato shrugged, then turned to Toraku. "Can we go?" "Yes, but we'll be walking." Minato waved a hand toward Kushina, who just ignored him, but she waved back to Toraku with a wide smile. "Crazy woman." Minato muttered to himself when they left the apartment and headed toward the shops in the town, slowly walking on a narrow backstreet. Their footsteps didn't make any noise, only the slowly flying dust marked their way, when their feet meet with the hard soil. "You had another flashback, didn't you?" "Ah, yes, but it was kind of personal, so I don't really want to talk about that if you don't mind." He was scratching his cheek nervously, and Minato smiled back knowingly. "Girls. Well, I would like to congratulate to you anyway." "For what?" "You did a very good job with Kushina. You wound her around your finger. She's quite sensitive about her hair." Toraku gave a confused look in response but then nodded. When they finished with shopping, Toraku felt as if he were a pack mule, despite most of the stuff being stored tidily into scrolls, thanks to Minato, who was wise enough to bring them so at least the half of the goods could be placed into them. It would be a pain in the ass if he should tote his brand new and indeed heavy 3 full set of kunais and shurikens with the other things. With around 10 minutes of continuous arguing, Toraku was glad that he could convince Minato that 20 packs of instant ramen was crucial inventory of his new apartment, even more than new clothes, but in return he made a promise that he would learn how to cook properly from Kushina, which actually wasn't a big deal. He was already looking forward it. "Are you sure I need all of these?" "Well, 2 hours ago you had only 1 set of clothes, and nothing else, so yes." "I doubt about that." Actually, Minato packed a lot of things that weren't immediately necessary, like dozens of empty scrolls. However, Toraku had a feeling that he already had a plan with those which would result in long and sleepless nights for him. When they finally arrived to their place, he collapsed on the couch, leaning back against its backrest while putting his arms onto his face to shroud his eyes and stretched out his legs. "I don't understand women. What could they love about this?" Minato just grinned at the comment while started to unseal the remaining goods from his scrolls until he finished. "Put these in their places, settle in, and we'll be awaiting you for dinner at 6. If you need anything, we'll be here, just knock." Toraku nodded, not even moving his head toward the blonde as he left the room the lazy way again. That was tiresome. He moved his eyes over to the goods, his arms still rested on his forehead, only shifting them to uncover his eyes. He let out an irritated sigh knowing he would be occupied with the packing almost the whole afternoon. "If I don't start it now, I'll never do it. But first, a bit of entertainment." He shut his eyes to survey his surroundings with a light chakra flow. "I got you," he chirped inside his head cheekily and moved to the window and waved toward a cherry tree with a grin, where he knew his shadow was hiding and watching him. "I can't help it, I just love poking fun at them." He moved from the window and let out a small sigh. At least there isn't any windows in the bathroom. He finally turned to the big pile with an irritated groan to face with his new obstacle. At exactly 6 o'clock, Toraku had been standing in front of a door only 5 meters from his own, pale orange one. He wasn't as worried as before. The meeting with Kushina calmed down his nerves, but he could feel that they tensed again. Meeting with a team. He was standing in his newly bought outfit, a pair of black pants, a pair of standard Shinobi sandals, and a white t-shirt with an orange spiral-like pattern on its front. He let out a breath and knocked on the door, which was flung open immediately. I really started to wonder if you would stay out here or come in the end. Toraku made an apologetic smile toward Kushina. Nervous? A little, he shrugged. You don't need to be. She caught his wrist after he left his sandals at the door, and she literally dragged him inside the sitting room, straight toward a big couch, where Minato was sitting together with a young girl with shoulder-length brown hair and 2 purple rectangles on each of her cheeks. Just in time, Toraku. No era Rin, this is Todoroki. Toraku, our new team member. Toraku made a low bow and moved closer to the duo sitting around the small table filled with snacks and drinks, hopping down next to Minato. Nice to meet you. Rin smiled back at him and he looked around the apartment, looking for the 4th member of the team, whom he had already met. Minato, the 4th member is Kakashikin, isn't he? Minato let out a sigh and nodded. Indeed, but he will be late. You look much better, Torakukin, since I last saw you. Confusion ran across his face. He tilted his head to the side as he eyed the young Kunoichi curiously. You know, we already met once. We found you on the training ground with Kakashikin. I was the one who gave you first aid. You looked pretty bad, I really didn't think you would survive. Toraku just blinked and bowed his head. Well, thank you for saving my life. I owe you one. He sent a wide smile toward the brown girl and looked after the outgoing Kushina. An awkward silence fell onto the small group. Minato didn't know how to act with his newly found brother, and vice versa, and Rin. She didn't know how to react to them either, seeing their tension. Thank Kami, a hurricane came into the room named Kushina with a tray filled with cups and a bottle of sake. Minato raised an eyebrow at her, but didn't dare to make a comment. He was grateful. She put it down on the table and hopped next to Rin with a wide smile. She eyed Toraku curiously and switched back and forth between the 2 blondes for half a minute. You know, even without that test everyone could tell the obvious. Rin's head flung up and raised an eyebrow at the statement. What do you mean by that, Kushina-san? She blinked toward Minato, who let out an irritated sigh. You didn't tell them? No, what do you think tonight's gathering was for? I won't run from house to house just for that. Before she could throw back a harsh comment, a knock could be heard from the door and Minato utilized the opportunity to flee to it, coming back later with Kakashi and hoping that Kushina calmed down during the brief interval. He had calculated well, she was eyeing Toraku again from head to toe, fully ignoring him after he waved a hand toward Kakashi. Kakashikin, you already met Torakukin. Take a seat and serve yourself. When everybody sat down, Kushina caught the opportunity to push Minato to the issue with a light hit from her elbow into the blonde's ribs. Okay, I'm going. He cleared his throat, switching his tone to the leader of the team. I think you already figured it out, but from today forward we have a new team member. Chunin Todoroki Toraku joined our village. I have spoken with Hokage and he agreed to get us back to active duty the day after tomorrow. We will meet at 9 at the usual place tomorrow for a little shake-up. Toraku raised an eyebrow at the statement, but before he could ask anything Minato continued, I'll pick you up. And also, before any rumors start to rise, I would like to clear some things about our new teammate, if you agree, Torakukin. He nodded while shifting on the couch. Torakukin had only joined to Konoha's shinobi forces a day ago, and before that he wasn't the part of the village. He lost his memories. Rin turned toward Toraku with a wondering look and eyed the teen from head to toe, making him shiver. You really don't remember a thing? He shook his head. Yes, that is the case. Kakashi narrowed his eyes, observing the blonde suspiciously and barked out toward him, earning an angry look from Minato. If you don't remember, you could be anyone. A murderer, for example, or a spy. Toraku raised an eyebrow, but something in his chest squeezed at those words. Kakashi, I think you aren't in a position to judge anything like that. Minato narrowed his eyes toward his silver-haired student, who was staring back at him stubbornly. After a minute of silent fighting, Kakashi moved his eyes toward Rin and just shrugged in his annoyance. Minato let out a long sigh and slowly shook his head at the reaction of his student. There is one more thing. Yesterday revealed that he has a relative here in Konoha. Rin narrowed her eyes, as did Kakashi as they now looked toward the two blondes sitting next to each other. And that is you. Kakashi stated without any hint of surprise, as he eyed the teen again more suspiciously, who in turn tried to tune out the disturbing tone of his voice, his previous behavior and the cold piercing eye. He was now annoyed. Calm down. Don't hit him. Don't hit him. Well, actually, yes. It seems that we are brothers. Minato nervously scratched the back of his head and looked to the still silent Toraku with a smile. Anyway, I would like to ask you to help him while he settles down. Toraku rolled his eyes in annoyance. You know, I'm not a child. How old are you actually? Asked Kushina curiously, but she received only a blank look. I don't know, around 18. He made a shrug and looked back at Kushina. Well, then we have to choose a birthday for you, don't we? Toraku had tilted his head to the side in his surprise, and smiled. Yes. Maybe. Then from now on it will be today. I already have something in mind. Toraku raised an eyebrow and looked at Minato, who just shrugged. Anyway, first I have this small bottle of fine sake, for celebration, and I think this is a good opportunity for that. One sip for the two brats and a normal portion for the three of us. Like the idea? Good. Then please, the cups. After the drink was portioned, Minato stood up to make a toast. To the new friends. And to the lost ones. The mood immediately tensed between the two young ninja, but they also raised their cups and drank it. Kushina slowly shook her head as the depression spread across the small trio. Minato, you're an idiot. You may be a genius, but you're still an idiot. Kakashi stared down to his lap after the pledge, buried in his thoughts. Emotions ran through his mind, but his only visible eye was cold as ice when the final one raised on his face. Anger. He isn't worth him. The one-eyed young boy muttered angrily, his eye focused on his cup on the desk while his hands rested on his knee. Minato narrowed his eyes and Kakashi clenched his hands into fists as he let his anger free. He isn't worth him. No one is worth him. Everybody tensed as the atmosphere became heavy around them. Enough. Minato barked out in a commanding voice. He was now again the leader of the team, as he switched the roles. No one could replace Obito. He is just an intruder, an outsider. He could be a spy, or an assassin who is after your life. Kakashi had risen from his seat unconsciously, his muscles tensed and his fists clutching painfully as the joints of his hand whitened by the strain. He looked at the blonde with pure hatred in his eyes and stormed away from the room, leaving behind the others in an awkward silence and Toraku with shocked, wide eyes. Minato had let out a sigh as he started rubbing his forehead with closed eyes, the feeling of an oncoming headache rising within it. Finally, Rin broke the silence after a long, tensed minute. I apologize for his behavior. Please forgive him, Torakuken, we've had a hard time the last 3 weeks. Rin's voice was soft, and sad as it died to whispering in the end. He just answered with a sad smile, as he didn't know what to say. His first reaction was anger, then confusion, but when he saw the tension and the reactions from the others, he restrained himself to jump at Kakashi before he left the room. Well, that went better than I expected. Kushina stated calmly while she sipped the sake in her hand, earning a confused look from Toraku. Would someone please be so kind as to enlighten me on what the hell that was? The blonde teen asked the people around him, earning another minute of tense silence, which was broken by Kushina. Obito was their teammate. He died during their last mission in IWA 3 weeks ago, and since then they were off duty. I'm sorry about that. Toraku shook his head slowly and fixed his eyes on the floor. Don't bother yourself about him. He will calm down in time when you know each other better. I doubt about that. Toraku leaned back on the couch and folded his hands in front of his chest with narrow eyes while Minato still rubbed his head in silence. Rin was again the one who tried to temper the mood. It will be okay. I promise. She sent a heartening smile toward the boy, who replied with a small doubting smile, but he felt the atmosphere of the room lighten. So, who's hungry? Kushina burst out loudly with absolute contrast of the past few minutes, earning grateful smiles from the group while they moved to the kitchen. The remaining time of the night passed in a much better mood, but the shadows of Kakashi's outburst was still hanging awkwardly above them. The night ended and Rin left the apartment, leaving the blondes and Kushina behind. When the redhead moved toward the kitchen to clean up the remains of their dinner, Minato turned toward Toraku at the doorstep. I'm really sorry about what happened. But please try to understand his feelings. Toraku shrugged before he answered with a calm tone. It's okay. I know that I still have a long way to go before I earn anyone's trust, including yours. He let the silence fall between them again. I'm prepared. Minato just nodded before Toraku left the apartment, watching him silently as he disappeared behind the door. The next morning was awkward. When they arrived at the training ground where Toraku was found, the remaining members of the team were already waiting for them. The blonde gratefully noted that the training ground was repaired, the large crater, which emitted the disgusting scent of his blood had disappeared, and only the lack of the green grass pointed that something had happened there before. Kakashi changed his tactics toward the young blonde. He was now just simply ignoring his presence, not even bothering to look in his direction, like he was simply invisible. And that was a bad tactic against him. When Toraku got up, he was determined to get along with Kakashi after the last night, but now his muscles tensed and he felt the anger spread across his chest, but he got over the temptation to punch the face of the arrogant, silver-haired shrimp. I hate being ignored, I can't stand this feeling. It would be much better if he just started to shout. Rin greeted him with a kind smile and a small wave of her hand as they reached the duo next to three thick poles. Before we start active duty, it would be essential for all of you to properly know each other's fighting style and to make a small team strategy accordingly. Kakashi turned his head spectacularly away from Toraku, earning an angry tension of muscles from the teen and a mimicked movement from him in response. Unfortunately they weren't aware of Minato's rolling eyes and Rin's slowly shaking head. What we are going to do, Minato-sensei? Rin was again the first to speak. This caught Kakashi's attention and he finally slowly turned toward their leader, still aware to not even let the minimal sight of the blonde teen into the corner of his eyes. It will be very simple. Minato was now grinning. Catch me. You have until dinner time to do so. Then, with a puff of smoke, he disappeared, leaving whirling leaves and the three teens in the clearing. Rin turned toward the others with pleading eyes, finding herself between the two irritated boys back to back with each other. The girl slowly shook her head again and let out a sigh at the childish behavior. Please, for Kami's sake, put aside your differences, or we will be wiped out in a minute. We have to act like a team if we even want to find him. Toraku turned toward Rin and glanced at Kakashi's back with a snort, crossing his arms in front of his chest, and turning away. Again. Not until he acknowledges my presence. Rin let out an irritated sigh and turned toward Kakashi. Please. The young masked ninja narrowed his eyes, but nodded to the girl. We are going to split up. Rake over the area, and if someone finds him, alert the others with a small chakra signal. That would also inform Minato about our presence and he'll just ration away. I got a better idea, stated Toraku calmly, earning a deadly look from Kakashi. I am the Jonin here, so I am the commander of this operation. Toraku just shrugged, but his eyes narrowed dangerously. Whatever. Arrogant brat. Rin shook her head and let out a hopeless sigh, but she hadn't the willpower to start convincing the young jonin that Toraku was right. This will be a long day. The three shinobi disappeared from the clearing as they jumped toward the woods around the training ground to find the fastest ninja of Konoha, who was watching them from a safe distance on a tree branch with narrowed eyes. This isn't going to be good. After 2 hours of a desperate hide-and-seek game with small success, the trio gathered again in the middle of the field. Toraku was unspeakably irritated because of Kakashi's annoyance. They wouldn't catch Minato like that, despite his sensing skills, but he also didn't want to act on his own. And Minato was good. If he didn't want to be found, he wouldn't. He almost scared his Anbu to death when he appeared in front of her to ask if she saw Minato somewhere, earning a flying kunai toward his head and an almost 10-minute-long argument with the bird-masked woman. "Can I speak now, Jonin Kakashi?" Toraku asked with undisguised sarcasm in his tone, earning an angry look from him and an irritated "tch. Whatever." The yellow flash of Konoha was standing on the previous branch, eyeing his team curiously, when he let out a small yelp of surprise and almost fell from the tree and onto his ass if he couldn't caught a branch. The place suddenly filled with replicas of Toraku. Not a dozen, not 50, but easily 200 or 300, which were now charging toward the four winds of the compass, including his direction. He realized that his mouth was open and he grinned as he shut it. Now, this is starting to become interesting. As the clones flooded the place, Minato had to be more and more aware where to Hiration. The whole training ground was already filled with his seals, as he prepared them as soon as he disappeared for the first time. However, he felt that maybe it wouldn't be enough this time. The rush was intense and continuous. Whenever he dispelled a clone, at least two replaced it in a second as the knowledge of his location flowed back to them. He found some clones of the other two team members mixed into the small army to distract him, which was actually almost successful when he faced a wildly grinning and laughing Kakashi after he appeared in a small clearing. After half an hour of continuous chasing without a break, he started to feel the effects. He had to admit, the tactic was good, and only with the sheer amount of clones could they tip-toed him continuously, leaving no time to recover. He sent a kunai toward a charging clone to dispel it, when three more appeared behind him to jump on his back. He easily deflected the attack with a roll to his left, where a fourth Toraku was already waiting for him, grinning. He used his Hiration to appear in a small clearing away from the mass he left, when an odd and cold feeling caught his leg. Minato looked down, to see Rin's familiar jutsu, as he started to sink into the ground, feeling as it hardened around his ankles. He sighed, and when he attempted to use his jutsu to escape from the trap, electricity ran across his spine, blocking his movement and mind to prevent his escape. At the moment the more disturbing than painful feeling disappeared, he felt three hands on himself and he looked at the grinning Toraku, the softly smiling Rin and the emotionless Kakashi. "We got you," Toraku stated with a sing-song voice. "Indeed. I have to admit you did a great job with this trap, but don't let the victory go to your head." When he finished the sentence, three blonde clones appeared without a sound behind them, each pointing a kunai to the back of their heads. In the blink of an eye, Minato was out of his prison without any effort and smiled proudly at their team when the clones disappeared. "Still, I think you all deserves a reward. I'm glad you managed the task. Tch. Kakashi was evidently irritated by the success of Toraku's plan. "I think it's time for lunch, everyone. Let's head to Ichiraku." He earned a cheerful "yeah" from Toraku, a smiling nod from Rin, and an irritated groan from Kakashi as they turned to head into the village. "Don't stare at me. You're annoying," Kakashi stated with a death glare toward Toraku, who just made a shrug at the comment, and continued to watch the boy from the other end of the counter. He was so damn curious about how the young jonin managed eating in a way that he couldn't peek behind his mask, not even for a millisecond. "Hey Kakashi. You got some kind of disease?" Kakashi narrowed his eyes and sent quite a large amount of killer intent toward the blonde. Or you got a hair lip, or ugly teeth, or what? Minato chuckled between the boys while Rin just rolled her brown eyes in her annoyance. They've been doing this since we arrived. Kakashi ignored the blonde and he turned away from him to finish his meal as fast as he could manage, in order to finally get rid of the annoying company. When everybody finished their meal, they sat in silence, enjoying their filled stomachs, when Minato turned toward them. I think that was enough for today. Now, everybody go home and rest. We will have a real mission tomorrow and I doubt it will be AD rank. The small group nodded and waved a hand as farewell, except Kakashi, who was still irritated by the blonde, though not as much as yesterday or in the morning. Minato shook his head as he left for his apartment with Toraku. The small team hopped from tree to arrive as fast as they just could to their destination. They were heading toward one of the guard posts, close to the border of Kusagakure and the Land of Fire, to transfer equipment scrolls to the infantry forces, and gain report scrolls for the Hokage. It was simple and Minato was satisfied with their first mission. He was grateful to Sarutobi for that. The team wasn't ready for anything more until they shaped back to their old selves and Toraku settled down into the team's daily routine. The fights with IWA seems to be over, however their mission's destination was more than disturbing. They were too close to the bad memories of their last mission, but it still held much less risk than the other front of the war with Kyumo. Minato wanted to finish the mission in record time, within 2 days. One there, one back, staying at the post for the night to rest. He moved at near full tilt, only slow enough that the remaining members of his team could keep up with him without overstraining themselves. However, it was still insanely fast compared to normal travel speed. During their trip Minato watched Toraku curiously, wondering how he would perform during his first real mission. Until this point he was satisfied with Toraku's behavior. When they left Konoha, he was cheerful, glad that he could be out of the gates and out of the ANBU investigation, and he instantly picked on Kakashi to rile him up during their trip. Minato looked back over his shoulder and smiled as the two young boys argued at the back of the team about something trivial. Just like with Obito. He sighed and turned backwards to face with them, still hopping from branch to branch, fully aware of his surroundings and the dangerously approaching branches at head level. He easily avoided them and hopped up, still traveling backwards. He rested his eyesight on Rin, whose face was a bit more ruddy than usual, then moved it toward the boys. They seemed to be fighting, but Minato knew that they were also paying attention to their environment as they immediately stopped the arguing and flung their heads toward him as soon as he faced with them. If only they focused their energy on the task at hand, we could have traveled faster, but still, I'm amused at Toraku's stamina. Even Kakashi's winded, yet he hasn't even broken a sweat. We are approaching the borders and we will reach our destination within 2 hours. Move to formation and be aware of everything around you. And from now on, not a sound if it is not about life or death. The three shinobi nodded, and placed themselves where they should be, forming a straight line, with Toraku at the back of Kakashi, who was now looking at Rin's back. She was centered to the middle as the only medical ninja in the team who could help them if necessary. The woods were silent, not even the cries of animals could be heard. Only their faint footsteps echoed amongst the trees as they were jumping and landing on the branches, making faint sounds to disturb the silence. The sun's last strong beams needled through the leaves, painting abstract light patterns on their faces. They traveled in complete silence with sharpened senses, without a word until they reached their destination just before twilight, a little bit drained by their insane speed. Thanks to Minato's hard training, the two veteran members were already used to this, and the new member also seemed familiar with the pace. Their trip was luckily uneventful, thank Kami, but when they arrived at the post Toraku's eyes widened and his mouth fell open from the loud cheer by which the remaining shinobi greeted Minato. When the hand shaking and shoulder clapping was finally over, he raised an eyebrow at Minato, demanding an explanation, but he just waved his hand in his irritation. Toraku narrowed his eyes as he watched Minato and Kakashi march out from the small bunker and then turned to Rin for any hint. Is he some kind of celebrity, or what? Rin chuckled and shook her head, still laughing. Kind of. In our last mission he took out almost the entire force of the remaining IWA ninjas that attacked near this guard post. Alone. So yes, you could say that he is famous. Most of the people here are alive only because of him. Toraku felt pride and he was in awe. My only known relative is a war hero. Wow. He's awesome. Yes, he is. Rin sent a sad smile back at him. They left the bunker to follow the others without a word, both buried in their own thoughts, one in sorrow, one in warm pride. Toraku's night was sleepless, due to the guards all over the facility and his sore muscles because of the long run. He couldn't sleep. The moon was already high in the inky black sky, and he was nervous. His senses sharpened subconsciously as his stress level grew. He was now extremely tense, because of his senses, that he couldn't even concentrate on suppressing them to a tolerable level. He could smell the dry blood at a faraway battlefield, and the scent of the animals in the woods. A bird shoot up from a nearby tree and he jerked up from his sleeping bag at the sudden noise. Hey, relax and sleep, or you'll faint tomorrow, he heard Minato's faint muttering next to him as he turned around to face with the sitting boy. I'm trying. But my senses just won't settle down and it's irritating like hell. He put his head into his palm, trying to ignore the continuously tapping animals and the smells of his environment. He let out an irritated groan and leaned back, trying to focus his mind on somewhere else, resting his crossed arms on his face. Toraku sneaked a peek at Minato between his arm to see he was now leaning against his wrist and watching him with a curious face. What? Minato just shrugged and leaned back, his head resting on his arms, to watch the night sky filled with sparkling stars. Toraku let his arms fall to his side and he sat up again, watching Minato hesitantly. Hey, Minato. Can I ask you something? It depends. Toraku rolled his eyes in the black night and he looked over his shoulder, where Rin and Kakashi laid in the same standard sleeping bag, evidently occupied by their dreams. What happened on your last mission? Why do you want to know? I'm curious. Furthermore, I want to understand them. He sneaked a peek behind him at the two sleeping shinobi again. Minato let out a sigh. It was 3 weeks ago, we split up. I came here to fight with the remaining IWA forces. They outnumbered us, and not just a little. Toraku nodded. He already knew about this. He was curious about Obito, but he didn't want to ask Rin or Kakashi. And they? Toraku's muscles tensed, as he heard an almost unnoticeable soft noise. He didn't move, but he saw Minato's silent nod with his eyes, that it was okay. They had another mission at the Shinobi Bridge. During it, Rin was captured, and when Kakashi and Obito went to save her, Obito died. I arrived too late. Silence fell amongst them, until Minato continued. Obito was an Uchiha. He was able to activate his Dojutsu, and before he died he offered it to Kakashi, who lost his left eye during the rescue attempt. Kakashi blames himself for his death. You know, Obito was like you in some ways. I'm sure you would have gotten along well. He was loud and cheerful, sometimes clumsy, and he was always late. Minato smiled as he remembered the shrimp with the orange goggles. Kakashi is his absolute polar opposite. A silent, tempered little prodigy who worships the rules. Or he was, until that time. Minato shook his head. Give him some time, please. Toraku nodded and leaned back to settle down in his sleeping bag again. Somehow, knowing this was calming down his aching nerves, and he now at least had something on his mind to focus on. It took only 5 more minutes before he finally fell asleep. You should also sleep, Kakashi. The young boy flinched in the sleeping bag as he laid with his back pointing to his sensei, staring in front of him to the nothingness. One of his eyes had been flaring with faint ruby light into the darkness of the night, before it disappeared when he closed his eyes. They arrived in Konoha in record time, to Minato's full pleasure, and the travel was eventless. Even Toraku had been cutting down on his taunting of Kakashi after their small talk. Well, not actually completely, but he was obviously restraining himself. Minato was very pleased with their performance. They dismissed the team at the gates of Konoha and he headed toward the Hokage Tower to make his report to Sarutobi. Toraku tensed as he instantly felt the familiar chakra signal of his shadow when turning toward his apartment, hopping from rooftop to shorten his way, in which a satisfying shower and the comfort of his bed awaited him. However, the temptation was just too great. He grinned and jumped toward a nook, landing gracefully in front of a surprised and attack-ready female Anbu. "Yo! You miss me, Anbu-san?" He gained an irritated "tch" from the young woman with a bird mask and she instantly hopped out of his sight, leaving the still grinning Toraku alone, who afterward continued his way after a quick shrug for his deserved shower and sleep. The next day passed without event after their arrival, and Toraku spent most of the day with Minato and Kushina, who forced the visit on him. He knew what game Kushina played. She wanted to help build their relationship and he was thankful for that, because he was clueless on how exactly to start it. Her cheery presence always helped them out if the familiar, awkward silence enveloped them during their conversations. Minato talked about his family, about his mother, and about their seemingly shared father, and he found out that Minato's parents died during his academy years when he was still very young. He even managed to see some photos of his parents. Another awkward silence fell onto them and Minato left the situation by excusing himself to the kitchen to get some drinks. The conversation savior was again the redhead as she arrived in the living room like a hurricane, with dozens of scrolls in her hands and some tucked under her arms. "Hey Minato, I've got everything that we need from the library to continue with our pet project." "Great." He moved next to her to help with the scrolls and moved them into their bedroom to place them tidily in one of the empty-shaped shelves on the wall. Minato hopped down onto the chair to get quite a large scroll and laid it open on the desk while he selected another from the new pile. He began to read, frowning heavily. "Sorry I stole your company. He'll likely be lost in his work for hours," Kushina said as she came toward Toraku with an apologetic look. "It's okay, Kushina-san. Don't call me that. It's just Kushina. That makes me feel old." "Then the same goes for you, also." Toraku gave her a foxy grin after he nodded, and he was surprised when she mimicked him, though in a more tempered way. It wasn't as much animalistic as his, but still held a hint of it. He really enjoyed Kushina's company. His heart always felt much lighter when he was near the redhead. He found out that they shared a common interest. Namely pranking and irritating the Anbu. For the remaining time in the dining room, Toraku helped her with the refining of a very sneaky prank that included pink hair dye and the Inuzuka clan's monthly grooming routine. When they finished most of the planning, the blonde's interest turned toward his relative in the next room. "What's he doing?" The redhead paused for a moment with a wondering look, thinking of what she should say, when an excited yelp reached them. "That was pretty fast," Kushina grinned to the confused Toraku while they moved toward the bedroom to stand behind Minato, who was now writing on the big scroll, frowning in concentration. Toraku waited, wondering when he would stick out his tongue, but instead he looked up from his work when he finished the last symbol to turn to Kushina. "Finally, I know where we moved in the wrong direction." The yellow flash of Konoha now looked like a 10-year-old boy on his birthday. Kushina moved closer as they looked at the wide scroll and Minato started explaining, pointing to several parts of the complex drawing. "Look. Here. I just had to reverse these two symbols, and with this little alteration it will become more stable, but still flexible enough to work as we wanted. However, this could also react with its resistance, but it will still be powerful enough to deflect an upper rank jutsu. The redhead frowned above the blonde, examining every part of the scroll. We're close, but still not close enough to our goal. Toraku moved closer to them as he also started to examine the image in front of him. The complex pattern formed an inverted square, surrounded by several symbols, kanji, and marks in various directions pointing to the inside of the whole pattern, where a small spiral was centered in the surrounding symbols. Toraku frowned while he examined the seal. His eyes traveled around every inch, noticing every curve and every line, every single brush stroke on the fine paper. He tilted his head to the side, waited for a moment, then reached for Minato's hand, which was still holding the brush. The couple froze at that movement, eyeing him curiously as he took the brush from the blonde's hand, leaned forward between them, and started to paint extra symbols on the fine scroll, frowning, without pause. Minato watched with wide eyes as his newly found relative moved toward the seal, not daring to even breath as he observed the fine hands working fast and precociously, without any mistake on the pattern, or even an unnecessary movement of his hand. Not a misplaced stroke, not a shaky line, nothing. Every brush stroke was perfect. He looked over to Kushina, who also mimicked his face, her eyes wide and her mouth had fallen open as she stared at the working teen. After 10 minutes of work, Toraku leaned back to examine his work from a distance as he tilted his head and tapped his chin, only to lean back again and continue for another 15 minutes in total silence. When he was finally ready, he put down the brush in its place, and only then was he brought back to reality. The blonde frowned and scratched his cheeks, while he thought. As you reversed the two symbols, you messed up the barrier's whole chakra circulating system by pairing two contrasting elements. However, you tried to encompass it with these symbols, but it would still remain unstable, and as you already said, it would affect the efficiency. With the water and the earth symbol here, and here, it will be more balanced, and with the additional kanji I used on the meridian it will become more powerful. A small power upgrade is always good. I also added a wind symbol here, so the barrier will be more manageable, and with this little guy here I modified the barrier's restraining level. It'll still be stable from the outside, but it'll also allow you to attack from the inside, kinda like a one-way road. Toraku tilted his head and tapped his chin while frowning as he thought, not bothering himself with the two frozen shinobi at his side. You used the compass rose as the base, which is good if you want to create a strong, generic barrier, but not too creative. If you use the guardians of the beams you could create a more flexible one and, of course, a more effective one with much less chakra usage. He looked from Minato to Kushina with a confused face as he saw their expressions. What? The older blonde finally made his mouth move, but only one word left it. Shit. For a long and disturbingly silent minute, they stayed in the same coma-like state. I know from Inoichi that you knew Fuinjutsu, but that's... Kushina chuckled when the amused Minato lifted his two hands and pointed toward the seal. The blonde teen looked at him with a confused face. You know Toraku, this blondie here was working on that barrier seal for more than a month, then you come finish it in less than half an hour. Minato finally gathered himself and pushed Toraku into the seat quite hastily while he started to choose random scrolls from the shelf. Okay. I'm fucking curious now. Toraku was shocked. He never, ever heard Minato bitching, it was mostly him. He watched as he put down one scroll and rolled it open, pointing at the symbols, but he only looked back with confusion. What the hell do you want from me with this? What do you see? The teen looked again at the seal for a minute, frowning. That's another barrier seal. However, it shocks the would-be intruder as well, not just keeps him out. But it could be also modified to increase its stability, because if you attack with a lightning attack it will become weak. Minato nodded and exchanged it with another, waiting for Toraku's answer, which arrived almost immediately. Ew, that's a pretty nasty modified explosion tag. Minato continued changing the seal scrolls in his hands until all were used, and he received answers for all of them, sometimes immediately as he saw a familiar seal, and other times he had to examine it to figure out its purpose, but none lasted longer than 10 minutes. Minato flopped down onto the bed in front of the desk and eyed his blonde relative with a contemplative face. Damn, he's good. With barriers he's even better than me. Konoha gained one more seal master. Minato looked at the wildly grinning redhead leaning on the desk behind Toriku, who shrugged at his amused face, while she refused to let the wide smile leave her face. Hey, Minato, give him the scroll. Let's see what he can do with it. What scroll? Toriku was now staring at Minato, frowning suspiciously at him, waiting for his answer. The blonde narrowed his eyes and looked back at Kushina for a while, then nodded. When you appeared, besides your torn clothes and some modified explosive tags, we found a scroll. Minato wasn't looking at Toriku and almost flinched, and the disappointed and angry voice reached him. Why didn't you tell me about this? After a silent minute, Minato moved to the desk and handed over a small scroll to the blonde from a drawer without a word, nor a look to his eyes. He don't want to see the anger and the betrayal that would greet him in those brilliant blue orbs. Toriku angrily grabbed the scroll out from Minato's hand and quickly turned away from him to examine the only touchable inheritance of his past. He gracefully raced his fingers along the side of the fine paper and closed his eyes. It wasn't ordinary paper, it was the finest he ever felt. No. It wasn't even paper. It was vellum. He opened his eyes and narrowed them as he examined the scroll, feeling the containment seal. He frowned. A 5-layered seal. The first layer was blood. The second layer was chakra. The third layer was another kind of chakra, but not with the standard attributes. The fourth layer was the existence of a specified summoning contract, but the fifth one. He wasn't quite sure what to make of it. It just seemed like a jumbled mess. What's the fifth layer and how did you open it? Where are my belongings? Minato gave a confused look at the angry teen. I couldn't. I also don't know what's necessary for the fifth layer. I didn't even figure out the third and the fourth until after some sleepless night. It's very tricky. You can't open it either? Toriku shook his head and his heart also calmed down when he heard Kushina's soft voice. This isn't something from my general knowledge. I don't know, this seems like a big mess of bull and nothing else. No base and no definition, only symbols thrown in randomly. A big mess of chaos. Minato nodded in his agreement, grateful to his red-headed girl for her interjection. Toriku's stomach gave a loud lurch and earned a chuckle from the redhead. Come on. Let's grab something to eat. The teen gave a wide smile to Kushina as they moved to the kitchen, while Minato was aware not to move too close to his still tense brother. Fortunately, Toriku wasn't a vindictive person, and finally after another half an hour, the previous incident almost seemed like it had never happened. Almost. Saratobi-sama. We have to act quickly. Minato nodded when he received the mission scroll from the old man. He started to frown as he read the given information. It seemed to be hit-and-run mission. The problem was that it would be near the borders of Kaminari no Kuni, where the aftermath fight still held some risk and some Kumo nins still hovered around the border. The mission was simple. Find a missing nin and bring him back. He was heading to Kumo with a very rare and valuable jutsu scroll stolen from the closed section of the library. No one too serious, only a Jonin-level ninja, however the scroll contained very sensitive information. Gather a 4-person team and depart immediately. Minato nodded. Hokage-sama. I would like to bring Kakashi, Kushina, and Toriku. Sarutobi closed his eyes for several moments considering Minato's request, then finally nodded in approval. Be careful. The blonde smiled back from the window and nodded. 30 minutes later his small team was standing at the village gates, waiting impatiently for Minato's arrival, shifting from foot to foot, while the 2 gate guards checked their exit form. Toraku was glad that Minato chose him for his extra private mission, and he was glad that he would see Kushina in action. He was very curious. Any time he asked Minato about her skills, he just chuckled, or changed the subject. Without any antecedent, the missing blonde appeared next to Redhead. "Hey sissy. You're late." Toraku's voice was followed by 5 pairs of raised eyebrows and a chuckle when he received a gentle and amused tapping on his back from Kushina. Minato just rolled his eyes, but it seemed the 2 Chunin guards next to the gate froze at the moniker. The yellow flash of Konoha was a sissy? Everybody in line, we're departing. Toraku and I will take the lead. Kakashi, Kushina, watch our backs. Cramped run until the borders. The 4 shinobi disappeared into the distance with a simple jump, leaving the still confused Chunin guards behind their desk with their mouths agape. Minato forced the team to sprint, jumping on the trees, forking in the clearings, and running straight forward in the green meadows with insane speed. Toraku and Minato found the trail of their rebel ninja not far from the village in the first few hours of their search. Unfortunately, the guy wasn't a fool and he covered up his tracks near perfectly. However, he couldn't keep up with the 2 blonde senses. Where Minato lost the chakra trail, Toraku would pick up the scent again. It was thought the shinobi had gotten at least half a day's advantage because the damn guards didn't react immediately. I'm sure this error will cost them their vests. They kept up the pace, and Toraku couldn't help wondering about Kushina's skills and stamina. He never saw her fighting style, nor even a single training move, but she seemed to be in shape. On her off days it seemed that Minato kept his distance from her, watching her every movement so she couldn't take it out on him, so that seemed to say something about her power. Minato suddenly stopped next to a huge pine. Toraku glanced up toward the sun. They had been traveling for 6 hours. We take a 15-minute break, no longer, or his lead will grow. Everybody sat down, their senses still sharpened, watching their surroundings, looking for anything suspicious. Minato crouched next to Toraku and Kushina, while Kakashi moved next to a tree trunk to take a soldier pill in order to shape up his muscles. I want to place a destination seal on you Toraku, for the Hiration. He blinked and suspiciously eyed Minato. It wasn't a request. It was a simple statement, but not quite an order. So, you can always sneak behind me wherever I am? Minato just rolled his eyes and pointed toward the others. Everybody on the team has one, save you, and I would be less troubled outside the village if you had one. The teen just nodded, murmuring under his breath, just don't use it while I'm in the bathroom, sissy. Said sissy, signed for him to turn around. He felt a hand on his neck, and he almost yelped in his surprise when he felt like someone was slowly pouring a bucket of ice-cold water down his back. He held back the yelp, but he couldn't control the continuous shivering until Minato finished. What the hell was that? That was a permanent marking. How permanent? Minato just smiled and tossed a ration bar to the irritated Toraku. Rest now. We will soon depart again. Toraku let out a sullen snort, but he opened the package of the ugly brown ration bar Minato tossed him and ate it without any noise or complaints. It was disgusting, but his body needed the nutrition from it, and, well, it didn't seem like he would get any ramen any time soon, so there wasn't anything for it. Toraku peeked toward Kakashi, hoping that maybe now he could see what was behind his mask. You know, Toraku, curiosity killed the cat. Kushina said with a small smile on her face, glancing toward the still staring blonde companion, who in the end just shrugged. It's time to go now. We can't let him slip through the borders or it'll be a lost cause. There would be too much trouble with the ninjas from Kumo if he escapes. Everybody nodded in agreement and they continued their trip trailing the renegade. They had to hurry. The guy still had at least 2 hours of leeway and the borders would only be closer and closer as time passed. Minato held up his hand and the small group immediately stopped at the side of a bigger clearing, close to the borderline and to their prey. Minato tensed, as did the others. Everything was silent, too silent. Toraku lightly sniffed at the air, trying to catch anything, but beside their prey scent on the other side of the opening, he could sense nothing between it. His mind screamed, trouble, without pause. Something was wrong here. As he tilted his head a little, he saw it in the sunlight. A very faint sparkle, but it was there. A sparkle of a wire in the middle of the clearing, in the height of the green grass, almost invisible. Toraku narrowed his eyes and tapped Minato's arm, pointing toward the thin wire, who nodded in acknowledgement. An obvious trap. But the lack of the trails in the clearing was disturbing. If he could cover his tracks this well, it points to the fact that the rebel deliberately left the trail, and not because he was in hurry. They were lured here. Minato. Kushina whispered behind his back, earning him a shiver as he felt every single hair on the back of his neck was now pointing toward the sky. I know. Minato gave hand signals to the team to disperse around the clearing, but before anyone could even move, a pale bright light manifested under their feet, revealing the pattern of a perfectly hidden seal. Toraku's eyes widened in shock, and in his surprise, his muscles tensed and his heart felt like it was going to explode as the adrenaline flooded through his system, to move. Yes, to move. But he couldn't even twitch a finger. Just like 3 weeks ago with the paralysis seals. A small team appeared at the other side of the clearing where the trader's trail faintly appeared again. The trees revealed a small group of satisfied Kyumo nins, inside another glowing seal. A barrier seal. So that's why we couldn't sense them. Toraku moved his eyes to the side toward Minato, unable to move his head, and realized that the other blonde stood next to him with closed eyes as his mind raced through the possible plans. The barrier disintegrated around the small group and Toraku heard the accelerating heartbeats and respiration behind from Kakashi and Kushina as their bodies prepared to fight. He fixed his eyes on the small approaching group, forcing his nerves to calm down, as did his brother at his side. That wasn't that tough. I expected much more from Konoha's yellow flash. I'm very disappointed. It seems that the tails were just that, one of the approaching ninja barked out with a loud laugh. Instead of talking, take them down and move. Hurry, a commanding voice echoed toward the small group behind the trees, and the Kyumo forces immediately tensed and obeyed, moving faster toward them. Minato opened his eyes, and moved them towards Toraku, who gave a nod with his own blue orbs in understanding. It was time to move. A moment later a yelp echoed from the woods together with a distant thump as something hit the ground behind the bushes. Within a blink of an eye, Minato simply disappeared from the seal and at least 20 exact copies of Toraku exploded from the ground, charging toward the Kyumo shinobi. Their plan was quite good, despite one small flaw. The enemy secured themselves by blocking their opponent's hand seals, but they didn't count on anyone who could use jutsu without them. And Toraku could, as well as Minato. At the moment the barrier seal disappeared around the Kyumo nins, he channeled his Kage Bunshins underground, all around the clearing and one more toward the small group of people, waiting unmoving in the shadows. The clones hid patiently, ready to swing to action when he got the sign from Minato. He made another clone under his feet, only to disappear immediately to send the memory for the others to start the operation. Plans rushed through Minato's mind. He couldn't move, and he couldn't prepare his special kunai to use Hiration. He gave a wide smirk in his mind when he felt Toraku's clone spread underground. Good move. Hell broke loose in the small clearing as the battle began, leaving the trio still under the seal with amused thoughts. Well, except Toraku, who was very well aware of what was happening behind the trees. 3 clones appeared in front of them, but they didn't move from their spots. One of them crouched to the ground, examining the still glowing seal, in attempt to remove the paralysis from them, but the constant muttering from the clone revealed that that wouldn't be so easy. He looked over his shoulder to shout to the real Toraku, "I need more time, boss." If he could speak, he would have shouted in his annoyance, but he still managed to press a snarl toward his copy. A Kumo-nin flew toward the barrier and the concentrating clone, as a well-aimed blast of wind shot toward his chest. One of the bunshins jumped in the way to disrupt the trajectory of the shinobi, who then crashed to a tree next to the trio. The shinobi dropped to the ground limply. "Hey! I'm trying to work here," the clone working on the seal shouted out toward a smaller group of himself, not masking the annoyance in his tone. The clearing was now filled with fighting Toricus and Kumo-nins. A duo at the side of the woods fought with their kunai in a life-or-death battle. The clone slashed his kunai toward his enemy, who ducked gracefully under his arm, aiming a stab toward the clone's abdomen. Before the weapon could dismiss the clone, he twisted to the side to evade the slash and grabbed his opponent's arm, throwing the surprised ninja onto his back. A flash of yellow locks appeared next to captured trio and Minato slammed his hand to the ground, dismissing the irritating seal as easily as if it were only a snap of his finger. The pale light faded away and they could relax from their forced pose, only to take a battle-ready position a second later. In the back of the group, Kakashi reached up and raised his Hitayat to free his glowing Sharingan. "I thought you forgot about us. I can't handle this stuff this quickly, that's your specialty," Toriku groaned toward the blonde with an irritated tone. "I was busy." Kakashi opened his mouth in warning as he felt the sparkling of the electricity, however, he hadn't the time to voice it as Toriku slammed his hands onto the ground just like his relative seconds ago, pinning a small piece of paper into the soil. Ink-black patterns surged out from the small paper tag, covering them with a faintly glowing purple barrier, locking them away. At that very moment, the ground filled with lightning as the remainder of the blonde army disappeared from the battlefield outside of the purple glow with a loud pop, filling the air with smoke and leaving the panting Kumo shinobi behind, untouched by the jutsu. Toriku straightened himself and watched as the barrier faded away slowly. "Nice move. You should teach that to me." Kushina's cheerful voice reached Toriku's ears, and he scratched his cheek with a smile. "That was only the prototype. I wasn't even sure it would work because of the size of the tag. You can chit-chat at home once we finish this," the until now silent Kakashi grunted. The woman turned her ruby head toward the young jonin, but before she could react to the insult, two people walked out of the woods toward the clearing. As they stepped out from the shadows and stopped in the middle of the clearing next to their comrades, Toriku's whole body convulsed and he dropped to one knee when a sudden pain reached his brain. "No good, no good. Brace yourself. This is a situation." He shook his head and glanced up to see Minato's glare at him from the corner of his narrowed eyes. The newcomers stared at the scene without word, until the tall, muscular, dark-skinned man with sunglasses moved his head toward Minato. "That blondie isn't looking too good." "TCH, just another sissy," a blonde teen girl next to the man snorted, watching as Toriku straightened himself and looked back at her in irritation, followed by the narrow eyes of Minato. "I'm not a sissy, kitty cat." The two Kumo shinobi evidently tensed after the sentence, and shared a surprised look, which wasn't missed by Minato's intense blue eyes. "Who are you?" the dark-skinned man asked the young blonde with narrowed eyes. At least, Minato thought they were narrowed behind the black sunglasses. It seems Toriku touched something very sensitive with his comment on the girl, but they obviously didn't know him. His muscles tensed, ready to attack any minute. "Why do you want to know, B-san?" It was the yellow flash of Konoha who answered the question, holding a hand in front of Toriku's chest, silencing him, but he received no answer from the small group. "It doesn't matter. What does matter is that you are about to cross our borders. We are trailing a criminal and this isn't the borderline. That is a pity. Unfortunately, I can't allow you to pass the line of this clearing." "I understand. However, we have to catch him." "So what will happen? Do you want to fight with us?" Minato narrowed his eyes, as his mind made a quick survey about their chances and tactics while the two teams eyed each other without movement. Disturbing silence had descended in the sunny clearing as each party weighed the options. Kakashi and Toraku could deal with the rest of the Kyumo shinobi, and it could be that B is a Jinchuriki, but Kushina can handle him. However, I don't know anything about the blonde girl next to B, but it looks like she is confident, and the fact that she stands with a Jinchuriki is disturbing. B, as it stands, was the brother of the Raikage, and he didn't want to add more fuel to the flames of the war with another incident. The original plan was to get the deserter inside their borderlines and not to deal with this level of conflict. Shit. The question was answered without word when two clones of Toraku jumped down next to Kushina, dragging an evidently unconscious body of a shinobi. His hands and feet were tied tightly with wires, and inky black lines of a seal trailed across his forehead. A giant scroll hung from one of the clones' back. "What the hell took you two so long?" Toraku barked toward his remaining clones, sheer annoyance blazing in his azure eyes. "What the? How did you?" the teen girl next to be hissed, looking at them with wide eyes, mimicking almost everybody's expression except the two blue-eyed shinobi. "Sorry, boss. That seal was pretty tricky," and Minato-sensei left without a word. "I almost sent another group to kick your lazy asses." "Our lazy ass is your lazy ass," one of the clones barked back, and Toraku scratched the back of his head. Hee hee. "Yeah, you're right. Anyway, we got what we came for." B's muscles tensed as he eyed the blonde Chunin, measuring him from head to toe. When they bumped into the newest missing ninja of Konoha and he offered the scroll in exchange for his life, they simply put him behind a barrier seal to deal with him later. A seal made by one of their very rare seal masters. A seal which couldn't be detected and couldn't be dismissed without the key. This guy is a tough one. Blondes. Always the trouble with blondes. "I think our business is done here, B-san." Minato straightened himself, but his muscles were still ready to jump any minute if need be. "I'm sorry, Minato-san, but I still can't let you go. We want that scroll. However, you can take back your traitor. Like hell we'll let you have it." Kushina barked out from the background. Her always kind and soft voice was now harsh, filled with anger. "That's really a pity. Then, we have our answer, I think. I'm sorry. As I told you before, I was really starting to like you." Minato moved to battle stance and he whispered his orders to their team. "Kakashi, clones, you guard the scroll. Toraku, back them up when able and handle the remaining Kyumo nins. Kushina and I will take care of the other two." Everybody stayed silent in the clearing, waiting for the other party to make the first move. Wind blew across the field, catching up someone's lost shawl, wriggling it in the air and dropping it in the middle of the opening. Several explosions shook the field as the shawl landed slowly on the almost invisible wire. Using that as a signal, everybody moved, unleashing the tension of the silent wait. Around 100 Torakus appeared in the clearing, charging toward the remaining Kyumo nins, leaving no time to rest. They had to act fast and get rid of them, to help Minato and Kushina. After this thought left Toraku's mind, the two Konoha shinobi disappeared from the clearing with B and the blonde girl in the blink of an eye. Kakashi's muscles tensed as the clone with the huge scroll on his back jumped backward to be as near the Jonin as he could manage without blocking his movement. Toraku left 5 more clones as a backup for the silver-haired boy. The remaining clones as well as the blonde occupied the Kyumo forces quite efficiently thanks to the numbers. The ground trilled in the clearing as one of the Kyumo nins released a powerful lightning attack. A sparkling yellow dragon ran through the opening straight ahead of Kakashi. The dragon knocked out several of his own comrades, and the idiot nin didn't seem to be bothered by this fact, nor that he also could have easily destroyed the precious scroll. However, Kakashi wasn't a Jonin for nothing. He jumped out of the way of the attack, leaving the crackling sound of the electronic discharge all over his body as the technique was too close and too fast to be so easily deflected, and sent back a Katon Jutsu to distract his enemy. The real Toraku jumped in front of the idiot and aimed a hit toward his neck, but he swept the attack away from himself, and with that movement he kicked his knee toward the blonde's stomach. Toraku turned to his side, letting the kick pass by his torso. He grabbed the leg of his opponent and swung himself around on his feet, to gather momentum. After 3 rotations, he let the ankle of the Kyumo ninja go and sent him flying toward another fighting group on the other side of the clearing. It wasn't too graceful a movement, but it was efficient. The shinobi landed on his comrade's back, pushing him to the ground, allowing the clones to knock them out with a blow to the back of their necks. 2 down. Toraku turned around to jump into another fight, replacing a disappearing clone on his right. The clones around Kakashi ebbed away as a kunoichi jumped in the middle of the small group. At the moment she landed, she sent kunai toward the clones successfully, dispelling all of them except the one with the scroll, who was now looking at her with burning eyes. The young jonin stepped in front of the clone and jumped into the battle with the brown-haired kunoichi. They slowly rounded each other, preparing for their dance. Kakashi moved his right hand behind his head and drew out a small katana. Not his father's lost heirloom, but it was very similar. His opponent also grabbed the long, traditional katana attached to her left to draw it. The fight started, filling the air with the clanging of the weapons. The fight was elegant, almost like a soft waltz between 2 lovers. They stepped toward each other, only to a second later turn around, aim a slash, and step aside in complete reverse of each other's movement. The clone watched the slow dance with keen senses and tensed muscles, ready to jump. He was now alone, and he couldn't let himself dispel. His head moved toward the others to register that the battles from quantity moved toward quality, as most of the enemy nins faced only with 1 or 2 clones. A duo kicked out their opponent, and the clone frowned at the scene. The 2 clones strafed around the middle-aged shinobi and slammed their palms toward him. For a moment nothing happened, but in the blink of an eye, the ninja fell to the ground limply like a marionette with its strings cut, as the 2 futon, cookie hanma, wind release, air hammer, reached him from both sides. Kakashi jumped over the kunoichi and spun in midair to aim a slash at her head. The kunoichi ducked and lifted her katana to deflect the attack, elegantly letting his weapon slip down from her own, creating sparks as the 2 razor-sharp blades met. She gracefully slipped away from Kakashi and spun around on her heels, aiming an elegant kick toward the jonin's head, who had just landed on the ground. He rolled away from his opponent and threw a shuriken toward the brown-haired girl, who deflected it with one well-aimed swing of her sword. The 2 fighters jumped backwards to catch their accelerating breaths. The kunoichi dropped her katana, which embedded itself into the soil to her right. She slapped her hands together and ran through a chain of seals, but she stopped midway, looking back to her opponent with wide eyes. He was imitating her movements perfectly, as if she was staring into a mirror. The shinobi shook her head and jumped to his right, charging around the silver-haired boy, running through another set of seals, only to realize that the boy was copying her hands' every movement. She narrowed her eyes and stopped her hands again and positioned herself between the clone and Kakashi. That's not good. The clone's muscles tensed as he eyed the back of the kunoichi. Who would be so stupid as to show their back to the enemy willingly? The clone narrowed his eyes, when a hand exploded from the ground in front of him, covered with the sparkling of electricity, aiming for his ankle. He rolled away just in time and jumped next to Kakashi, hitting the young jonin on the top of his head. Need help with the lady, shrimp? The clone earned an ice-cold glare from Kakashi, who answered with a smirk and moved backward, out of their way. His eyes moved around one more time to find the boss at the other side of the clearing. Toraku felt the burning eyes of himself on his back, but he hadn't the time to turn around as he deflected a chakra-powered hit aimed for the left of his neck. He ducked onto the ground, and dug his fingers into the soft grass. He moved into a handstand on one of his palms and he spun around on his axis, landing behind the Kyumo nin with an elegant jump. He was quite satisfied with his taijutsu. After the assessment, he trained non-stop to improve his sloppy moves. He had a lot of styles and moves in his head, and with the results of 3 sleepless nights he managed to recreate the flow of his movements again. He aimed the butt of his kunai toward the shinobi's neck to knock him out, but before he could reach him, he felt a hand move toward his stomach. He moved backward, to avoid the touch. Electricity ran through him, despite the lack of contact, as the lightning chakra jumped from body to body, causing his limbs and muscles to spasm. His muscles screamed because of the unnatural movement and strain as another wave of spasms ran through them. He clenched his teeth together to restrain his pained yelps, but he forced his eyes open. He had to keep them open. When the man finally released the attack, Toraku backed away from the shinobi as fast as he could manage with his sore limbs and his still twitching muscles. He rotated his head around his shoulders, a spark of remaining electricity ran through his form, chirping like a bird, his eyes darkening as he locked his azure orbs on the panting ninja in front of him with narrowed eyes. "You shouldn't have done that." Toraku hissed through his teeth and a satisfied half-smile appeared on his face as his enemy gulped and took one step backward. 10 seconds later the shinobi laid on the grass after he was hit down by one of Toraku's wind releases. The blonde gave a final annoyed look at the limp body of his previous opponent, leaving his ragged form behind, and ran toward Kakashi with the only Kyumo ninja left on her feet. He passed a small group of his clones, who were dragging the knocked-out enemy nins toward a tree to tie them around it. Toraku jumped next to his clone with the scroll, who let out a relieved sigh and handed the scroll to him, disappearing with a puff. The duel continued in front of him as he eyed the young jonin and the kunoichi. They were around the same strength, the only big difference was within their experiences. The woman was evidently a veteran with honed reflexes, while on the other hand even though Kakashi was a prodigy with great potential and skills, the lack of real battle experience was conspicuous. Toraku let his chakra spread out to found Kushina and Minato. Before it could reach the edge of the clearing, an explosion echoed in the air. When the enormous wave of pressure reached the clearing, it sent the surprised kunoichi flying toward Toraku, who utilized the opportunity and knocked her out with a swift kick, causing her to fall down limply to the soil a meter from his foot. Kakashi and Toraku shared a worried look and jumped into the woods, sprinting toward the route of the attack. Minato jumped toward B and the blonde kunoichi with insane speed, together with Kushina. They landed in front of the duo and Minato grabbed them, disappearing from the center of the clearing. The quartet reappeared a safe distance from the others, under a giant redwood which was previously marked by the destination seal. Kushina and Minato jumped backward to gain some distance from their opponents, who surprisingly looked quite good after their first experience of Hiration. "Man. You know, I already lived through a lot of disturbing things, but that is in the top 3. However, I appreciate your move. It wouldn't be quite a good thing if we fought there. I'm glad you approve, B-san." Minato nodded toward Kushina, who turned toward the blonde teen. Kushina charged toward her opponent. The kunoichi jumped backward, luring her away from the 2 shinobi. The redhead narrowed her eyes in annoyance. "Hey Flaky. How long are you planning to play this game of tag?" Kushina received no answer from the teen, only an annoyed look. She couldn't help it, a wide sneer ran across her delicious features. "It's been a while since I've had some fun." She pumped chakra into her foot, and sprung herself toward the teen, whose eyes were now wide with surprise. Her hand dived into her kunai holder and grabbed as many weapons as she could hold with one hand, and jumped into the air toward the teen. Her ruby hair flowed behind her back in the rhythm of her movement as she threw the kunai one by one at her opponent. The teen gracefully avoided every single kunai, her movement was elegant and fluid, just like a cat's. The redhead launched another wave of shuriken toward the blonde, who was now standing below the branch where she landed after her first attack. The kunoichi fluidly jumped up the tree, almost like she was floating, to face against Kushina. They jumped toward each other, each of them holding a kunai in their hands. The soft clinging broke the silence of the woods while they jumped toward each other, only to land on another tree to repeat their moves. In the next jump, Kushina rolled around in midair, and beside pushing her kunai toward the blonde, she caught her wrist and slammed her toward the tree where she jumped from. However, the imminent impact never came as the teen veered around in the air and landed in a crouch, parallel to the ground on the tree trunk. Kushina frowned as the teen's eyes started to fade away, leaving nothing more than the plain white eyeballs. Her canines grew and an almost animalistic grunt left her mouth. The teen launched toward the redhead with increased speed and kicked her down from the tree to impact into the ground with a small yelp. Kushina narrowed her eyes and spit out a small amount of blood in a not very feminine manner, and let an animalistic grin spread across her face. "So, you want to play rough, kitty? How about we continue from where we left off last time, B-san? This time I won't let it end in a tie." "We shall see," Minato smiled back to his opponent. B jumped toward Minato with a katana in his hand, ready to slash a long cut where Minato's left eye was. Before the contact, Minato jumped over his head. While in the air, he threw a strange kunai with 3 prongs towards the sky. Shuriken Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Shuriken Shadow Clone Technique. When Minato released the technique, his 3-pronged shuriken multiplied into hundreds, flying across the trees and sticking everywhere within 100 meters. A tentacle reached toward him with insane speed, but before it could even touch him, he disappeared in the blink of an eye, appearing a meter behind B. He spun on his heels, and jumped backwards to gain more distance, carefully avoiding the kunai in his proximity. The Kyumonin sent another tentacle toward Minato, who disappeared centimeters before he could reach him. Another tentacle shot out from his body, toward the blonde, where he reappeared, not letting him to stay in one spot more than a second. The fight started to resemble a silly game of whack-a-mole. After minutes of chasing, B had more tentacles on his body than his own limbs. Minato appeared at the closest kunai on one of the trees, tired of the game of tag, and threw a shuriken toward the Kyumonin, forcing him to jump back toward one of his special kunai. He appeared behind B and tossed his weapon directly into his spine. He heard a gurgle come from his opponent, but he jumped back when the form melted away. An ink clone. At the moment his left foot touched the soil, a hand emerged from the ground and locked onto his ankle like a vice. He used his only option to release himself before the technique reached him. Despite the quick hydration onto a tree, he still felt as pure electricity surged through his limbs for a brief moment. Small electrostatic sparks ran through his body, and despite avoiding most of it, it still wasn't a decent feeling. Raitun, Jibashi, lightning style, earth flash. I'm amused. You're the first person to actually touch me in years. You've been practicing since our last fight. Thanks. I'll take that as a compliment. B breathed in a large amount of air and exhaled black ink from his mouth, spreading it over everything around him, including Minato's kunai and his seals. The blonde stood up from his crouching position, eyeing the result with amusement. Now, that is very interesting. However, he disappeared only to reappear behind B, pointing a kunai at the back of his head, whispering into his ears, "It won't help you." Shit. How many markers did I get? 2. Doesn't this feel like déjà vu? Not really. It should. At that moment Minato felt something pointing toward his abdomen. He moved his eyes down and saw a small katana in B's hand. Indeed. Suddenly, an enormous explosion could be heard not far away from them, and B muttered only one word with a frustrated tone that made Minato smile, despite being only centimeters from killing each other. Women. Indeed. An overwhelming sonic boom reached the previous battlefield, forcing Minato and B to jump toward a tree before the impact and glue themselves to the surface with chakra. They needed every bit of chakra control to stay on the tree. When the wind of the explosion died down, 2 struggling forms impacted into the ground exactly where they were a second ago, cutting a deep scar across it. One person jumped backward from the impact, her body covered with blue chakra flames, eyes burning with pure white light. Kushina straightened herself, and 3 golden chakra chains shoot out of her body toward the teenage girl, who gracefully jumped to the side to avoid them with cat-like swiftness. A tentacle shot toward Minato, catching him off guard and pulling him further away from the newcomers. 4 figures burst out from the trees between Kushina and the blonde girl. A tensed Kakashi, a staring Toraku with an open mouth and a big scroll attached to his back, and a clone holding the unconscious renegade on his shoulder appeared from the thick bushes. "Where are the others?" B shouted at the newcomers with narrowed eyes. "Alive, tied to a tree." Kakashi narrowed his eyes while he answered, eyeing the wriggling tentacles as they moved back to their body, and the flaming girl in front of him. "Everybody back off. I won't leave you two here alone." Toraku yelled out as anger flushed his face. "That was an order, not a request. Sensei." Kakashi's voice was cracked and sore, and Toraku tried again to reason with Minato. "But Toro, I won't leave my comrades behind." Minato narrowed his eyes after the blonde's interruption, but he didn't let his eyes move away from B. He felt as Kakashi moved closer to Toraku, signaling that he also wouldn't leave regardless of being told. "Ah, this is a really sweet scene. I'm almost crying," the young blonde girl purred out the words then let out a barking laugh. "Shut up, bitch Databane." Kushina burst out, spitting the words out from her mouth like it was poison. "What did you just call me?" The blue chakra ominously started intensely twisting and shooting out of the girl's body, moving like a surreal animal on her skin as her anger grew. The flame-like chakra grew bigger and bigger around the girl, until a howl left her mouth and she launched herself toward Kushina with insane speed, who prepared to deflect the attack. Her muscles tensed, ready to jump, when she felt electricity lock her muscles, preventing her from moving. From the corner of her eyes she saw the last hand sign of B. Minato moved immediately, but a tentacle shot out toward him at the same time, forcing him to use his Hiration, and appeared behind Kushina instead of attacking the charging girl. I was too late. The only thing he could see from his spot behind the ruby-red locks was another slowly trembling blonde head with spiky locks in front of a pair wide, pure white eyes. The disgusting metallic smell of blood was already starting to fill the air around them, suppressing the flora's natural aroma. He could hear Kakashi's increasing heartbeat only steps away. Minato wanted to scream, but not even a squeak came out from his mouth. He already knew what happened. He couldn't even see when the teen moved between Kushina and the attack. The movement was insanely fast. His own azure eyes filled with pure anger, blazing as bright as the girl's now fading chakra flames seconds ago during her fury. These eyes met with the girl's white ones, forcing her to instantly jump backward, causing Toraku to flinch, and a bloody cough escaped the blonde. His hands fell down limply to his sides after releasing the girl's arms, which he held as far away from himself as he could to stop the attack. The teen girl looked down to her own blood-soaked hand in disbelief, trying desperately to shake the crimson liquid off herself. Minato moved his eyes toward B, his body trembling from the growing fury starting to burn his insides like acid. Kushina's eyes were wide with shock and anger, her iris turned to slits and her blue orbs transformed to a reddish color. She could feel the growing rage inside her core, filling her mind with a dense red fog. She felt the urge. The urge to tear flesh, the urge to kill. Leave. Another bloody cough left the blonde's mouth after this one word left his mouth, his words holding nothing but power and determination, without any hint of pain. Standing still, his eyes locked on B and the shocked teen. A small stream of blood appeared on each side of his mouth, drawing a thin, red line as it slowly trickled down his chin. Yujito. We're leaving. Now. The blonde girl flinched and jumped next to B, disappearing from the woods after gathering their teammates from the clearing. Kushina grabbed the still-standing teen and slowly laid him down on the ground, forcing the last conscious part of her mind to banish her blood-lust away as she examined the teen's chest. Her hands now glowed with green chakra above Toriku's chest, letting the healing energy into his body. Yujito's hand almost went through the right side of his chest, fortunately not completely, but damaged the upper part of his lung badly. I have to stop the bleeding first, or he could drown. Kushina. Minato's voice was now powerless as he knelt down next to the blonde, and he could only wanly sense as Kakashi slowly approached them without a sound. He'll be okay. It's not as bad as I first thought. The blonde teen turned his head toward the kunoichi, enjoying the warm sensation filling his chest and slowly washing away the pain, leaving only a dull memory of it in his mind. You're an idiot. You know that, Toriku? The teen smiled back at Kushina. Yeah. Somebody already told me. Something like that. There's no doubt that you two are related. One minute the two of you act like intelligent human beings, the next you're like stupid, ignorant children. Acting reckless, like you're some kind of Superman. Toriku let his mouth form into a small smile and closed his eyes. They felt heavy. I'm tired. A small nap would be nice. He felt cold. Very cold. After a minute, his limbs started trembling, at first only a little, but now his whole body was shivering continuously, but that was only a dull feeling at the back of his mind. Everything around him became blurry, his senses dulled, even the voices around him became nothing more than muffles. Kushina. I don't know what's happening, it seemed like he was getting better, Databane. Do something, Kushina-san. I'm doing it. Oh shit. That bitch got his arteries. I got it. A sudden yelp echoed inside Toriku's head and he flinched back to reality by the overwhelming sensation of a new pain. A pain which started eating away his chest, tearing into his flesh, into his lungs. Burning him from the inside like acid, flowing toward his stomach, his intestines, and slowly reaching every part of his body. His vision became crimson red and it slowly took over his brain, and his thoughts, taking him farther and farther away from the woods near the Kyumo border, into the darkness. Kushina. What the hell are you doing? It wasn't me, Databane. I didn't pull out its chakra. It's doing it. The pain suddenly disappeared, but he couldn't persuade himself to open his eyes. He was floating. Slowly drifting with the rhythm of the water. It was nice, calm, silent, and safe. Only the water's dripping reached his ears. However, he knew that he had to open his eyes soon. But not now. I want to relax with this sensation a little bit more. He felt something encompass his body. Something warm and smooth, stroking his whole body like the finest silk as it touched his skin. I should go. With this innocent thought, the sensation left, leaving emptiness and regret in his mind and soul. Like he got back something important, only to have someone violently uproot it from his flesh. Toriku opened his eyes, as slowly as he could managed. He was really floating. He was swaying on the surface of water. A pond maybe. No. It wasn't a pond. It wasn't as natural. It was more industrial. He could even smell the metal and rust in the distance. He let his vision clear and he sat up on top of the water, defying every law of nature, defying the force attempting to pull him down into the dark abyss. He knew that the water was deep beneath him. He just knew it. He slowly turned his head around, forcing his eyes to examine every little detail in the gloaming light. Toriku lazily turned his head to the other side and established that it was the same. He slowly straightened, but his legs immediately sank down into the water when he stood on them, sending raw panic toward his brain, but it stopped when the water reached his ankle. His heart calmed down as he felt the hard and cold concrete floor under his bare feet. He shook his head and looked around once more. He was in a corridor. The concrete wall was spotted with gaslights, sending an unnatural yellowish glow along the passage. He turned around to choose a path, but the right direction looked just as good as the left one. After a shrug, he simply turned right. Nothing changed as he moved forward, the corridor was the same. Sometimes he passed by a burnt-out lamp, but that was the only change in the monotony. Wandering in the water, which felt like hours, he at last saw something in the distance. The end of the sewer. Yes, it was a sewer. He realized it in the first hour of his walk. Perhaps later, or perhaps earlier. He lost track of time a while ago. His mind was now filled with hope, as something was definitely in front of him as he approached it. He made his last wobbly steps, to find a door. A rusty metal door, with monstrous hinges and without a handle. A surreal pattern was carved into its rusty surface, but he couldn't recognize what could it be. He had been standing there watching the door for what felt like hours before he finally made the last 2 steps and touched it with his shaking hands. It felt warm. Not hot, just warm, like a nice breeze in springtime. The temptation was overwhelming as he leaned closer to the door, and placed his palms on its surface, feeling every inch of the fine carving. He slowly leaned closer, his cheeks were now touching the surface, enjoying its warmth with closed eyes, forgetting about everything, about time, about space. A distant voice reached his ears from the other side of the door. Almost unnoticeable, he thought he could more feel the vibration on the surface than actually hear it. It was the sound of something moving, rubbing against something continuously. Toraku let a small smile on his face as the warm sensation increased from the door, warming up his whole body from head to toe. He slowly raised his hand, and after a hesitant moment, he gently knocked on the door, leaving unnaturally loud taps echoing in the passage for a few seconds. No answer. He closed his eyes again, pushing himself further into the door, when he felt it. The impact as something ran against the door once. Then twice. Causing the hinges to tremble. Toraku moved slowly backwards, one step after another, as the thing rushed against the door and as his fear increased more and more with each step. The hinges now moved menacingly out of their places, millimeter by millimeter, the metal now starting to bulge by the continuous impacts, and Toraku felt as the panic took over his brain. He stepped backwards once more, but suddenly the concrete floor disappeared under his feet, and nothing could help him as he fell backwards, slowly, but unstoppably. He splashed into the dark water, which now felt different. It was now thick almost like oil, not gently tepid, but cold as ice as it engulfed him like a disgusting animal. Toraku was struggling in vain to reach the surface, but it grabbed him, pulling him down into the deep, inky black abyss. He let out his last breath, watching the bubbles as they moved farther and farther, as the yellow glow of the gaslight faded away in the distance, leaving him alone, sinking unstoppably into the complete darkness of the endless abyss. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. Guys, make sure to help the author by visiting the link in the description. This is Fox Sage, and I'm signing off.